Section 14 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 5. Towards the end of the session of 1836, the hopes of the Conservative party were again in the ascendant. The tadpoles and the tapers had infused such enthusiasm into all the country attorneys, who, in their turn, had so bedevilled the registration, that it was whispered in the utmost confidence, but as a flagrant truth, that reaction was at length a great fact. All that was required was the opportunity. But as the existing Parliament was not 2 years old, and the Government had an excellent working majority, it seemed that the occasion could scarcely be furnished. Under these circumstances, the backstairs politicians, not content with having by their premature movements already seriously damaged the career of their leader, to whom in public they pretended to be devoted, began weaving again their old intrigues about the court, and not without effect. It was said that the royal ear lent itself with no marked repugnance to suggestions which might rid the sovereign of ministers, who, after all, were the ministers not of his choice, but of his necessity. But William IV, after 2 failures in a similar attempt, after his respective embarrassing interviews with Lord Grey and Lord Melbourne on their return to office in 1832 and 1835, was resolved never to make another move unless it were a checkmate. The King, therefore, listened and smiled, and loved to talk to his favourites of his private feelings and secret hopes, the first outraged, the second cherished, and a little of these revelations of royalty was distilled to great personages, who in their turn spoke hypothetically to their hangers-on of royal dispositions and possible contingencies, while the hangers-on and go-betweens in their turn looked more than they expressed, took county members by the button into a corner, and advised as friends the representatives of boroughs to look sharply after the next registration. Lord Monmouth, who was never greater than in adversity, and whose favourite excitement was to aim at the impossible, had never been more resolved on a dukedom than when the Reform Act deprived him of the 12 votes which he had accumulated to obtain that object. While all his companions in discomfiture were bewailing their irretrievable overthrow, Lord Monmouth became almost a convert to the measure which had furnished his devising and daring mind, palled with prosperity, and satiated with a life of success, with an object and the stimulating enjoyment of a difficulty. He had early resolved to appropriate to himself a division of the county in which his chief seat was situate, but what most interested him, because it was most difficult, was the acquisition of one of the new boroughs that was in his vicinity, and in which he possessed considerable property. The borough, however, was a manufacturing town, and returning only 1 member, it had hitherto sent up to Westminster a radical shopkeeper, one Mr. Jawster Sharp, who had taken what is called a leading part in the town on every crisis that had occurred since 1830, one of those zealous patriots who had got up penny subscriptions for gold cups to Lord Grey, cries for the bill, the whole bill and nothing but the bill, and public dinners where the victual was devoured before grace was said, a worthy who makes speeches, passes resolutions, votes addresses, goes up with the deputations, has at all time the necessary quantity of confidence in the necessary individual, confidence in Lord Grey, confidence in Lord Durham, confidence in Lord Melbourne, and can also, if necessary, give 3 cheers for the King, or 3 groans for the Queen. But the days of the genus Jawster Sharp were over in this borough as well as in many others. He had contrived in his lustre of agitation to feather his nest pretty successfully, by which he had lost public confidence and gained his private end. 3 hungry Jawster Sharps, his hopeful sons, had all become commissioners of one thing or another, temporary appointments with interminable duties. A Low Church son-in-law found himself comfortably seated in a chancellor's living, and several cousins and nephews were busy in the excise. But Jawster Sharp himself was as pure as Cato. He had always said that he would never touch the public money, and he had kept his word. It was an understood thing that Jawster Sharp was never to show his face again on the hustings of Darlford. The Liberal party was determined to be represented in future by a man of station, substance, character, a true reformer, but one who wanted nothing for himself, and therefore might, if needful, get something for them. They were looking out for such a man, but were in no hurry. The seat was looked upon as a good thing, a contest certainly, every place is contested now, but as certainly a large majority. Notwithstanding all this confidence, however, reaction or registration, or some other mystification, had produced effects even in this creature of the Reform Bill, the good borough of Darlford. The borough that, out of gratitude to Lord Grey, returned a jobbing shopkeeper twice to Parliament as its representative without a contest, had now a Conservative association, with a banker for its chairman and a brewer for its vice-president, and 4 sharp lawyers nibbing their pens, noting their memorandum books, and assuring their neighbours with a consoling and complacent air that property must tell in the long run. Whispers were also about that when the proper time arrived a Conservative candidate would certainly have the honour of addressing the electors. No name mentioned, but it was not concealed that he was to be of no ordinary calibre, a tried man, a distinguished individual, who had already fought the battle of the Constitution and served his country in eminent posts, honoured by the nation, favoured by his sovereign. These important and encouraging intimations were ably diffused in the columns of the Conservative journal, and in a style which, from its high tone, evidently indicated no ordinary source and no common pen. Indeed, there appeared occasionally in this paper articles written with such unusual vigour that the proprietors of the Liberal journal almost felt the necessity of getting some eminent hand down from town to compete with them. It was impossible that they could emanate from the rival editor. They knew well the length of their brother's tether. Had they been more versant in the periodical literature of the day, they might, in this slashing style, have caught perhaps a glimpse of the future candidate for their borough, the Right Honourable Nicholas Rigby. Lord Monmouth, though he had been absent from England since 1832, had obtained from his vigilant correspondent a current knowledge of all that had occurred in the interval, all the hopes, fears, plans, prospects, manoeuvres, and machinations, their rise and fall, how some had bloomed, others were blighted, not a shade of reaction that was not represented to him, not the possibility of an adhesion that was not duly reported. He could calculate at Naples at any time within 10 the result of a dissolution. The season of the year had prevented him crossing the Alps in 1834, and after the general election he was too shrewd a practiser in the political world to be deceived as to the ultimate result. Lord Eskdale, in whose judgment he had more confidence than in that of any individual, had told him from the first that the pear was not ripe. Rigby, who always hedged against his interest by the fulfilment of his prophecy of irremediable discomfiture, was never very sanguine. Indeed, the whole affair was always considered premature by the good judges, and a long time elapsed before Tadpole and Taper recovered their secret influence, or resumed their ostentatious loquacity, or their silent insolence. The pear, however, was now ripe. Even Lord Eskdale wrote that after the forthcoming registration a bet was safe, and Lord Monmouth had the satisfaction of drawing the Whig minister at Naples into a cool 1,000 on the event. Soon after this he returned to England, and determined to pay a visit to Coningsby Castle, feast the country, patronise the borough, diffuse that confidence in the party which his presence never failed to do. So great and so just was the reliance in his unerring powers of calculation and his intrepid pluck. Notwithstanding Schedule A, the prestige of his power had not sensibly diminished, for his essential resources were vast, and his intellect always made the most of his influence. True, however, to his organisation, Lord Monmouth, even to save his party and gain his dukedom, must not be bored. He therefore filled his castle with the most agreeable people from London, and even secured for their diversion a little troupe of French comedians. Thus supported, he received his neighbours with all the splendour befitting his immense wealth and great position, and with one charm which even immense wealth and great position cannot command, the most perfect manner in the world. Indeed, Lord Monmouth was one of the most finished gentlemen that ever lived, and as he was good-natured, and for a selfish man even good-humoured, there was rarely a cloud of caprice or ill temper to prevent his fine manners having their fair play. The country neighbours were all fascinated. They were received with so much dignity and dismissed with so much grace. Nobody would believe a word of the stories against him. Had he lived all his life at Coningsby, fulfilled every duty of a great English nobleman, benefited the country, loaded the inhabitants with favours, he would not have been half so popular as he found himself within a fortnight of his arrival, with the worst county reputation conceivable, and every little squire vowing that he would not even leave his name at the castle to show his respect. Lord Monmouth, whose contempt for mankind was absolute, not a fluctuating sentiment, not a mournful conviction ebbing and flowing with the circumstances, but a fixed, profound, unalterable instinct, who never loved any one and never hated any one except his own children, was diverted by his popularity, but he was also gratified by it. At this moment it was a great element of power. He was proud that, with a vicious character, after having treated these people with unprecedented neglect and contumely, he should have won back their golden opinions in a moment by the magic of manner and the splendour of wealth. His experience proved the soundness of his philosophy. Lord Monmouth worshipped gold, though if necessary he could squander it like a caliph. He had even a respect for very rich men. It was his only weakness, the only exception to his general scorn for his species. Wit, power, particular friendships, general popularity, public opinion, beauty, genius, virtue, all these are to be purchased. But it does not follow that you can buy a rich man. You may not be able or willing to spare enough. A person or thing that you perhaps could not buy became invested, in the eyes of Lord Monmouth, with a kind of halo amounting almost to sanctity. As the prey rose to the bait, Lord Monmouth resolved that they should be gorged. His banquets were doubled, a ball was announced, a public day fixed. Not only the county, but the principal inhabitants of the neighbouring borough were encouraged to attend. Lord Monmouth wished it, if possible, to be without distinction of party. He had come to reside among his old friends, to live and die where he was born. The chairman of the Conservative Association and the vice president exchanged glances which would have become Tadpole and Taper. The four attorneys nibbed their pens with increased energy, and vowed that nothing could withstand the influence of the aristocracy in the long run. All went and dined at the castle. All returned home, overpowered by the condescension of the host, the beauty of the ladies, several real princesses, the splendour of his liveries, the variety of his viands, and the flavour of his wines. It was agreed that at future meetings of the Conservative Association they should always give Lord Monmouth and the House of Lords, superseding the Duke of Wellington, who was to figure in an after-toast with the Battle of Waterloo. It was not without emotion that Coningsby beheld for the first time the castle that bore his name. It was visible for several miles before he even entered the park, so proud and prominent was its position on the richly wooded steep of a considerable eminence. It was a castellated building, immense and magnificent, in a faulty and incongruous style of architecture indeed, but compensating in some degree for these deficiencies of external taste and beauty by the splendour and accommodation of its exterior, and which a Gothic castle, raised according to the strict rules of art, could scarcely have afforded. The declining sun threw over the pile a rich colour as Coningsby approached it, and lit up with fleeting and fanciful tints the delicate foliage of the rare shrubs and tall thin trees that clothed the acclivity on which it stood. Our young friend felt a little embarrassed when, without a servant and in a hack chaise, he drew up to the grand portal, and a crowd of retainers came forth to receive him. A superior servant inquired his name with a stately composure that disdained to be supercilious. It was not without some degree of pride and satisfaction that the guest replied, "Mr. Coningsby." The instantaneous effect was magical. It seemed to Coningsby that he was borne on the shoulders of the people to his apartment. Each tried to carry some part of his luggage, and he only hoped his welcome from their superiors might be as hearty. End of chapter 5. Book 4, Chapter 6. It appeared to Coningsby, in his way to his room, that the Castle was in a state of great excitement. Everywhere bustle, preparation, moving to and fro, ascending and descending of stairs, servants in every corner, orders boundlessly given, rapidly obeyed, many desires, equal gratification. All this made him rather nervous. It was quite unlike Beaumanoir. That also was a palace, but it was a home. This, though it should be one to him, seemed to have nothing of that character. Of all mysteries, the social mysteries are the most appalling. Going to an assembly for the first time is more alarming than the first battle. Coningsby had never before been in a great house full of company. It seemed an overwhelming affair. The sight of the servants bewildered him. How then was he to encounter their masters? That, however, he must do in a moment. A groom of the chambers indicates the way to him as he proceeds with a hesitating yet hurried step through several large antechambers and drawing-rooms. Then doors are suddenly thrown open, and he is ushered into the largest and most sumptuous saloon that he had ever entered. It was full of ladies and gentlemen. Coningsby, for the first time in his life, was at a great party. His immediate emotion was to sink into the earth, but perceiving that no one even noticed him, and that not an eye had been attracted to his entrance, he regained his breath and in some degree his composure, and standing aside endeavoured to make himself, as well as he could, master of the land. Not a human being that he had ever seen before. The circumstance of not being noticed, which a few minutes since he had felt as a relief, now became a cause of annoyance. It seemed that he was the only person standing alone whom no one was addressing. He felt renewed and aggravated embarrassment, and fancied, perhaps was conscious, that he was blushing. At length his ear caught the voice of Mr. Rigby. The speaker was not visible. He was at a distance, surrounded by a wondering group, whom he was severally and collectively contradicting. But Coningsby could not mistake those harsh, arrogant tones. He was not sorry indeed that Mr. Rigby did not observe him. Coningsby never loved him particularly, which was rather ungrateful, for he was a person who had been kind, and on the whole serviceable to him. But Coningsby writhed, especially as he grew older, under Mr. Rigby's patronising air and paternal tone. Even in old days, though attentive, Coningsby had never found him affectionate. Mr. Rigby would tell him what to do and see, but never asked him what he wished to do and see. It seemed to Coningsby that it was always contrived that he should appear the protégé or poor relation of a dependent of the family. These feelings, which the thought of Mr. Rigby had revived, caused our young friend, by an inevitable association of ideas, to remember that, unknown and unnoticed as he might be, he was the only Coningsby in that proud castle, except the lord of the castle himself, and he began to be rather ashamed of permitting a sense of his inexperience in the mere forms and fashions of society so to oppress him, and deprive him, as it were, of the spirit and carriage which became alike his character and his position. Emboldened and greatly restored to himself, Coningsby advanced into the body of the saloon. On his legs, wearing his blue ribbon, and bending his head frequently to a lady who was seated on a sofa and continually addressed him, Coningsby recognised his grandfather. Lord Monmouth was somewhat balder than 4 years ago, when he had come down to Montham, and a little more portly perhaps, but otherwise unchanged. Lord Monmouth never condescended to the artifices of the toilet, and indeed, notwithstanding his life of excess, had little need of them. Nature had done much for him, and the slow progress of decay was carried off by his consummate bearing. He looked, indeed, the chieftain of a house of whom a cadet might be proud. For Coningsby, not only the chief of his house, but his host too. In either capacity he ought to address Lord Monmouth. To sit down to dinner without having previously paid his respects to his grandfather, to whom he was so much indebted, and whom he had not seen for so many years, struck him as not only uncourtly, but as unkind and ungrateful, and indeed in the highest degree absurd. But how was he to do it? Lord Monmouth seemed deeply engaged, and apparently with some very great lady. And if Coningsby advanced and bowed, in all probability he would only get a bow in return. He remembered the bow of his first interview. It had made a lasting impression on his mind, for it was more than likely Lord Monmouth would not recognise him. 4 years had not sensibly altered Lord Monmouth, but 4 years had changed Harry Coningsby from a schoolboy into a man. Then how was he to make himself known to his grandfather? To announce himself as Coningsby, as his lordship's grandson, seemed somewhat ridiculous. To address his grandfather as Lord Monmouth would serve no purpose. To style Lord Monmouth grandfather would make everyone laugh, and seem stiff and unnatural. What was he to do? To fall into an attitude and exclaim, "Behold your grandchild," or "Have you forgotten your Harry?" Even to catch Lord Monmouth's glance was not an easy affair. He was much occupied on one side by the great lady, on the other were several gentlemen who occasionally joined in the conversation, but something must be done. There ran through Coningsby's character, as we have before mentioned, a vein of simplicity which was not its least charm. It resulted, no doubt, in a great degree from the earnestness of his nature. There never was a boy so totally devoid of affectation, which was remarkable, for he had a brilliant imagination, a quality that from its fantasies and the vague and indefinite desires it engenders, generally makes those whose characters are not formed affected. The Duchess, who was a fine judge of character, and who greatly regarded Coningsby, often mentioned this trait as one which, combined with his great abilities and acquirements so unusual at his age, rendered him very interesting. In the present instance it happened that while Coningsby was watching his grandfather, he observed a gentleman advance, make his bow, say and receive a few words, and retire. This little incident, however, made a momentary diversion in the immediate circle of Lord Monmouth, and before they could all resume their former talk and fall into their previous positions, an impulse sent forth Coningsby, who walked up to Lord Monmouth, and standing before him said, "How do you do, grandpapa?" Lord Monmouth beheld his grandson. His comprehensive and penetrating glance took in every point with a flash. There stood before him one of the handsomest youths he had ever seen, with a mien as graceful as his countenance was captivating, and his whole air breathing that freshness and ingenuousness which none so much appreciates as the used man of the world. And this was his child, the only one of his blood to whom he had been kind. It would be exaggeration to say that Lord Monmouth's heart was touched, but his good nature effervesced, and his fine taste was deeply gratified. He perceived in an instant such a relation might be a valuable adherent, an irresistible candidate for future elections, a brilliant tool to work out the dukedom. All these impressions and ideas, and many more, passed through the quick brain of Lord Monmouth ere the sound of Coningsby's words had seemed to cease, and long before the surrounding guests had recovered from the surprise which they had occasioned them, and which did not diminish when Lord Monmouth, advancing, placed his arms round Coningsby with a dignity of affection that would have become Louis XIV, and then, in the high manner of the old court, kissed him on each cheek. "Welcome to your home," said Lord Monmouth. "You have grown a great deal." Then Lord Monmouth led the agitated Coningsby to the great lady, who was a princess and an ambassadress, and then placing his arm gracefully in that of his grandson, he led him across the room and presented him in due form to some royal blood that was his guest, in the shape of a Russian Grand Duke. His Imperial Highness received our hero as graciously as the grandson of Lord Monmouth might expect, but no greeting can be imagined warmer than the one he received from the lady with whom the Grand Duke was conversing. She was a dame whose beauty was mature but still radiant. Her figure was superb, her dark hair crowned with a tiara of curious workmanship. Her rounded arm was covered with costly bracelets, but not a jewel on her finely formed bust, and the least possible rouge on her still oval cheek. Madame Colonna retained her charms. The party, though so considerable, principally consisted of the guests at the castle. The suite of the Grand Duke included several counts and generals. Then there were the Russian ambassador and his lady, and a Russian prince and princess, their relations. The Prince and Princess Colonna and the Princess Lucretia were also paying a visit to the Marquis, and the frequency of these visits made some straight-laced magnificoes mysteriously declare that it was impossible to go to Coningsby. But as they were not asked, it did not much signify. The Marquis knew a great many very agreeable people of the highest ton, who took a more liberal view of human conduct, and always made it a rule to presume the best motives instead of imputing the worst. There was Lady St. Julian's, for example, whose position was of the highest. No one more sought. She made it a rule to go everywhere and visit everybody, provided they had power, wealth, and fashion. She knew no crime except a woman not living with her husband. That was past pardon. So long as his presence sanctioned her conduct, however shameless, it did not signify. But if the husband were a brute, neglected his wife first, and then deserted her, then, if a breath but sullies her name, she must be crushed. Unless, indeed, her own family were very powerful, which makes a difference, and sometimes softens immorality into indiscretion. Lord and Lady Gaverstock were also there, who never said an unkind thing of anybody. Her ladyship was pure as snow, but her mother having been divorced, she ever fancied she was paying a kind of homage to her parent, by visiting those who might some day be in the same predicament. There were other lords and ladies of high degree, and some who, though neither lords nor ladies, were charming people, which Lord Monmouth chiefly cared about, troops of fine gentlemen who came and went, and some who were neither fine nor gentlemen, but who were very amusing or very obliging, as circumstances required, and made life easy and pleasant to others and themselves. A new scene, this, for Coningsby, who watched with interest all that passed before him. The dinner was announced as served. An affectionate arm guides him at a moment of some perplexity. "When did you arrive, Harry? We shall sit together. How is the Duchess?" inquired Mr. Rigby, who spoke as if he had seen Coningsby for the first time, but who indeed had, with that eye which nothing could escape, observed his reception by his grandfather, marked it well, and inwardly digested it. End of chapter 6. Section 15 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 7. There was to be a first appearance on the stage of Lord Monmouth's theatre to-night, the expectation of which created considerable interest in the party, and was one of the principal subjects of conversation at dinner. Villebecque, the manager of the troupe, had married the actress Stella, once celebrated for her genius and her beauty, a woman who had nothing of the vices of her craft, for though she was a fallen angel, there were, what her countrymen style, extenuating circumstances in her declension. With the whole world at her feet, she had remained unsullied. Wealth and its enjoyments could not tempt her, although she was unable to refuse her heart to one whom she deemed worthy of possessing it. She found her fate in an Englishman, who was the father of her only child, a daughter. She thought she had met him a hero, a demigod, a being of deep passion and original and creative mind. But he was only a voluptuary, full of violence instead of feeling, and eccentric because he had great means with which he could gratify extravagant whims. Stella found she had made the great and irretrievable mistake. She had exchanged devotion for a passionate and evanescent fancy, prompted at first by vanity and daily dissipating under the influence of custom and new objects. Though not stainless in conduct, Stella was pure in spirit. She required that devotion which she had yielded, and she separated herself from the being to whom she had made the most precious sacrifice. He offered her the consoling compensation of his settlement, which she refused, and she returned with a broken spirit to that profession of which she was still the ornament and the pride. The animating principle of her career was her daughter, whom she educated with a solicitude which the most virtuous mother could not surpass. To preserve her from the stage and to secure for her an independence were the objects of her mother's life, but nature whispered to her that the days of that life were already numbered. The exertions of her profession had alarmingly developed an inherent tendency to pulmonary disease. Anxious that her child should not be left without some protector, Stella yielded to the repeated solicitations of one who from the first had been her silent admirer, and she married Villebecque, a clever actor and an enterprising man who meant to be something more. Their union was not of long duration, though it was happy on the side of Villebecque and serene on that of his wife. Stella was recalled from this world, where she had known much triumph and more suffering, and where she had exercised many virtues which elsewhere, though not here, may perhaps be accepted as some palliation of one great error. Villebecque acted becomingly to the young charge which Stella had bequeathed to him. He was himself, as we have intimated, a man of enterprise, a restless spirit, not content to move for ever in the sphere in which he was born. Vicissitudes are the lot of such aspirants. Villebecque became the manager of a small theatre and made money. If Villebecque without a sou had been a schemer, Villebecque with a small capital was the very chevalier law of theatrical managers. He took a larger theatre, and even that succeeded. Soon he was recognised as the lessee of more than one, and still he prospered. Villebecque began to dabble in opera houses. He enthroned himself at Paris. His envoys were heard of at Milan and Naples, at Berlin and St. Petersburg. His controversies with the Conservatoire at Paris ranked among state papers. Villebecque rolled in chariots and drove cabriolets. Villebecque gave refined suppers to great nobles who were honoured by the invitation. Villebecque wore a red ribbon in the buttonhole of his frock and more than one cross in his gala dress. All this time the daughter of Stella increased in years and stature, and, we must add, in goodness. A mild, soft-hearted girl, as yet with no decided character, but one who loved calmness and seemed little fitted for the circle in which she found herself. In that circle, however, she ever experienced kindness and consideration. No enterprise, however hazardous, no management, however complicated, no schemes, however vast, ever for a moment induced Villebecque to forget La Petite. If only for one breathless instant, hardly a day elapsed but he saw her. She was his companion in all his rapid movements, and he studied every comfort and convenience that could relieve her delicate frame in some degree from the inconvenience and exhaustion of travel. He was proud to surround her with luxury and refinement, to supply her with the most celebrated masters, to gratify every wish that she could express. But all this time Villebecque was dancing on a volcano. The catastrophe which inevitably occurs in the career of all great speculators, and especially theatrical ones, arrived to him. Flushed with his prosperity and confident in his constant success, nothing would satisfy him but universal empire. He had established his despotism at Paris, his dynasties at Naples and at Milan, but the North was not to him, and he was determined to appropriate it. Berlin fell before a successful campaign, though a costly one, but St. Petersburg and London still remained. Resolute and reckless, nothing deterred Vilebek. One season all the opera houses in Europe obeyed his nod, and at the end of it he was ruined. The crash was utter, universal, overwhelming, and under ordinary circumstances a French bed and a brazier of charcoal alone remained for Vilebek, who was equal to the occasion. But the thought of La Petite and the remembrance of his promise to Stella deterred him from the deed. He reviewed his position in a spirit becoming a practical philosopher. Was he worse off than before he commenced his career? Yes, because he was older, though to be sure he had his compensating reminiscences. But was he too old to do anything? At 45 the game was not altogether up, and in a large theatre, not too much lighted, and with the artifices of a dramatic toilet, he might still be able successfully to reassume those characters of coxcombs and muscadins in which he was once so celebrated. Luxury had perhaps a little too much enlarged his waist, but diet and rehearsals would set all right. Vilebek in their adversity broke to La Petite that the time had unfortunately arrived when it would be wise for her to consider the most effectual means for turning her talents and accomplishments to account. He himself suggested the stage, to which otherwise there were doubtless objections, because her occupation in any other pursuit would necessarily separate them. But he impartially placed before her the relative advantages and disadvantages of every course which seemed to lie open to them, and left the preferable one to her own decision. La Petite, who had wept very much over Vilebec's misfortunes, and often assured him that she cared for them only for his sake, decided for the stage, solely because it would secure their not being parted, and yet, as she often assured him, she feared she had no predisposition for the career. Vilebek had now not only to fill his own parts at the theatre at which he had obtained an engagement, but he had also to be the instructor of his ward. It was a life of toil, in addition to labour and effort that need scarcely have been made to the exciting exertion of performance and the dull exercise of rehearsal, but he bore it all without a murmur, with a self-command and a gentle perseverance which the finest temper in the world could hardly account for. Certainly not when we remember that its possessor, who had to make all these exertions and endure all this wearisome toil, had just experienced the most shattering vicissitudes of fortune, and had been hurled from the possession of absolute power and illimitable self-gratification. Lord Eskdale, who was always doing kind things to actors and actresses, had a great regard for Vilebek, with whom he had often supped. He had often been kind, too, to La Petite. Lord Eskdale had a plan for putting Vilebek, as he termed it, on his legs again. It was to establish him with a French company in London at some pretty theatre, Lord Eskdale to take a private box, and to make all his friends do the same. Vilebek, who was as sanguine as he was good-tempered, was ravished by this friendly scheme. He immediately believed that he should recover his great fortunes as rapidly as he had lost them. He foresaw in La Petite a genius as distinguished as that of her mother, although as yet not developed, and he was boundless in his expressions of gratitude to his patron. And indeed of all friends, a friend in need is the most delightful. Lord Eskdale had the talent of being a friend in need. Perhaps it was because he knew so many worthless persons. But it often happens that worthless persons are merely people who are worth nothing. Lord Monmouth, having written to Mr. Rigby of his intention to reside for some months at Coningsby, and having mentioned that he wished a troupe of French comedians to be engaged for the summer, Mr. Rigby had immediately consulted Lord Eskdale on the subject as the best current authority. Thinking this a good opportunity of giving a turn to poor Vilebek, and that it might serve as a capital introduction to their scheme of the London company, Lord Eskdale obtained for him the engagement. Vilebek and his little troupe had now been a month at Coningsby, and had hitherto performed 3 times a week. Lord Monmouth was content, his guests much gratified. The company, on the whole, much approved of. It was indeed, considering its limited numbers, a capital company. There was a young lady who played the old woman's parts, nothing could be more garrulous and venerable, and a lady of maturer years who performed the heroines, gay and graceful as May. Vilbec himself was a celebrity in characters of airy insolence and careless frolic. Their old man, indeed, was rather hard, but handy, could take anything either in the high serious or the low droll. Their sentimental lover was rather too much bewigged, and spoke too much to the audience, a fault rare with the French, but this hero had a vague idea that he was ultimately destined to run off with the princess. In this wise affairs had gone on for a month, very well, but not too well. The enterprising genius of Vilbec, once more a manager, prompted him to action. He felt an itching desire to announce a novelty. He fancied Lord Monmouth had yawned once or twice when the heroine came on. Vilbec wanted to make a coup. It was clear that La Petite must sooner or later begin. Could she find a more favourable audience, or a more fitting occasion, than were now offered? True it was, she had a great repugnance to come out, but it certainly seemed more to her advantage that she should make her first appearance at a private theatre than at a public one, supported by all the encouraging patronage of Coningsby Castle, than subjected to all the cynical criticism of the stalls of St. James. These views and various considerations were urged and represented by Vilbec to La Petite, with all the practised powers of plausibility of which so much experience as a manager had made him master. La Petite looked infinitely distressed, but yielded as she ever did, and the night of Coningsby's arrival at the castle was to witness in its private theatre the first appearance of Mademoiselle Flora. End of chapter 7. Book 4, Chapter 8. The guests reassembled in the great saloon before they repaired to the theatre. A lady on the arm of the Russian prince bestowed on Coningsby a haughty but not ungracious bow, which he returned, unconscious of the person to whom he bent. She was, however, a striking person, not beautiful, her face indeed at the first glance was almost repulsive, yet it ever attracted a second gaze. A remarkable pallor distinguished her. Her features had neither regularity nor expression, neither were her eyes fine, but her brow impressed you with an idea of power of no ordinary character or capacity. Her figure was as fine and commanding as her face was void of charm. Juno, in the full bloom of her immortality, could have presented nothing more majestic. Coningsby watched her as she swept along like a resistless fate. Servants now went round and presented to each of the guests a billet of the performance. It announced in striking characters the début of Mademoiselle Flora. A principal servant, bearing branch lights, came forward and bowed to the Marquess. Lord Monmouth went immediately to the Grand Duke and notified to his Imperial Highness that the comedy was ready. The Grand Duke offered his arm to the Ambassadress. The rest were following. Coningsby was called. Madame Colonna wished him to be her beau. It was a pretty theatre, had been rapidly rubbed up and renovated here and there, the painting just touched, a little gilding on a cornice. There were no boxes, but the ground floor, which gradually ascended, was carpeted and covered with armchairs, and the back of the theatre with a new and rich curtain of green velvet. They are all seated. A great artist performs on the violin, accompanied by another great artist on the piano. The lights rise. Somebody evidently crosses the stage behind the curtain. They are disposing the scene. In a moment the curtain will rise also. "Have you seen Lucretia?" said the Princess to Coningsby. "She is so anxious to resume her acquaintance with you." But before he could answer the bell rang and the curtain rose. The old man, who had a droll part to-night, came forward and maintained a conversation with his housekeeper. Not bad. The young woman who played the grave matron performed with great finish. She was a favourite and was ever applauded. The second scene came. A saloon tastefully furnished, a table with flowers arranged with grace, birds in cages, a lapdog on a cushion, some books. The audience were pleased, especially the ladies. They liked to recognize signs of bon ton in the details of the scene. A rather awful pause, and Mademoiselle Flora enters. She was greeted with even vehement approbation. Her agitation is extreme. She curtsies and bows her head as if to hide her face. The face was pleasing and pretty enough, soft and engaging. Her figure slight and rather graceful. Nothing could be more perfect than her costume, purely white, but the fashion consummate. A single rose her only ornament. All admitted that her hair was arranged to admiration. At length she spoke. Her voice trembled, but she had a good elocution, though her organ wanted force. The gentlemen looked at each other and nodded approbation. There was something so unobtrusive in her mien that she instantly became a favourite with the ladies. The scene was not long, but it was successful. Flora did not appear in the next scene. In the fourth and final one of the act she had to make a grand display. It was a love scene, and rather of an impassioned character. Villebecque was her suitor. He entered first on the stage. Never had he looked so well, or performed with more spirit. You would not have given him 25 years. He seemed redolent of youth. His dress, too, was admirable. He had studied the most distinguished of his audience for the occasion, and had outdone them all. The fact is, he had been assisted a little by a great connoisseur, a celebrated French nobleman, Count d'O, who had been one of the guests. The thing was perfect, and Lord Monmouth took a pinch of snuff and tapped approbation on the top of his box. Flora now reappeared, received with renewed approbation. It did not seem, however, that in the interval she had gained courage. She looked agitated. She spoke. She proceeded with her part. It became impassioned. She had to speak of her feelings, to tell the secrets of her heart, to confess that she loved another. Her emotion was exquisitely performed, the mournful tenderness of her tones thrilling. There was throughout the audience a dead silence. All were absorbed in their admiration of the unrivalled artist. All felt a new genius had visited the stage. But while they were fascinated by the actress, the woman was in torture. The emotion was the disturbance of her own soul. The mournful tenderness of her tones thrilled from the heart. Suddenly she clasped her hands with all the exhaustion of woe. An expression of agony flitted over her countenance, and she burst into tears. Villebecque rushed forward, and carried rather than led her from the stage. The audience stood looking at each other, some of them suspecting that this movement was part of the scene. "She has talent," said Lord Monmouth to the Russian ambassadress, "but wants practice. Villebecque should send her for a time to the provinces." At length Monsieur Villebecque came forward to express his deep regret that the sudden and severe indisposition of Mademoiselle Flora rendered it impossible for the company to proceed with the piece, but that the curtain would descend to rise again for the second and last piece announced. All this accordingly took place. The experienced performer who acted the heroines now came forward and disported most jocundly. The failure of Flora had given fresh animation to her perpetual liveliness. She seemed the very soul of elegant frolic. In the last scene she figured in male attire, and in air, fashion, and youth beat Villebecque out of the field. She looked younger than Coningsby when he went up to his grandpapa. The comedy was over, the curtain fell, the audience, much amused, chattered brilliant criticism, and quitted the theatre to repair to the saloon, where they were to be diverted to-night with Russian dances. Nobody thought of the unhappy Flora, not a single message to console her in her grief, to compliment her on what she had done, to encourage her future. And yet it was a season for a word of kindness. So at least thought one of the audience, as he lingered behind the hurrying crowd, absorbed in their coming amusements. Coningsby had sat very near the stage. He had observed with great advantage and attention the countenance and movements of Flora from the beginning. He was fully persuaded that her woe was genuine and profound. He had felt his eyes moist when she wept. He recoiled from the cruelty and callousness that, without the slightest symptom of sympathy, could leave a young girl who had been labouring for their amusement and who was suffering for her trial. He got on the stage, ran behind the scenes, and asked for Mademoiselle Flora. They pointed to a door. He requested permission to enter. Flora was sitting at the table, with her face resting on her hands. Villebecque was there, resting on the edge of the tall fender, and still in the dress in which he had performed in the last piece. "I took the liberty," said Coningsby, "of inquiring after Mademoiselle Flora," and then advancing to her, who had raised her head, he added, "I am sure my grandfather must feel much indebted to you, mademoiselle, for making such exertions when you were suffering under so much indisposition." "This is very amiable of you, sir," said the young lady, looking at him with earnestness. "Mademoiselle has too much sensibility," said Villebecque, making an observation by way of diversion. "And yet that must be the soul of fine acting," said Coningsby. "I look forward, all look forward, with great interest to the next occasion on which you will favour us." "Never," said La Petite, in a plaintive tone. "Oh, I hope never." "Mademoiselle is not aware at this moment," said Coningsby, "how much her talent is appreciated. I assure you, sir," he added, turning to Villebecque, "I heard but one opinion, but one expression, of gratification at her feeling and her fine taste." "The talent is hereditary," said Villebecque. "Indeed, you have reason to say so," said Coningsby. "Pardon. I was not thinking of myself. My child reminded me so much of another this evening. But that is nothing. I am glad you are here, sir, to reassure mademoiselle." "I came only to congratulate her, and to lament for our sakes as well as her own, her indisposition." "It is not indisposition," said La Petite in a low voice, with her eyes cast down. "Mademoiselle cannot overcome the nervousness incidental to a first appearance," said Villebecque. "A last appearance," said La Petite. "Yes, it must be the last." She rose gently, she approached Villebecque. She laid her head on his breast and placed her arms round his neck. "My father, my best father, yes, say it is the last." "You are the mistress of your lot, Flora," said Villebecque, "but with such a distinguished talent—" No talent. You are wrong, my father. I know myself. I am not of those to whom nature gives talents. I am born only for still life. I have no taste except for privacy. The convent is more suited to me than the stage." "But you hear what this gentleman says," said Villebecque, returning her embrace. "He tells you that his grandfather, my Lord Marquess, I believe, sir, that every one that—" "Oh, no," said Flora, shaking her head. "He comes here because he is generous, because he is a gentleman, and he wished to soothe the soul that he knew was suffering. Thank him, my father, thank him for me and before me, and promise in his presence that the stage and your daughter have parted for ever." "Nay, mademoiselle," said Coningsby, advancing and venturing to take her hand, a soft hand, "make no such resolutions to night. Monsieur Villebecque can have no other thought or object but your happiness, and believe me, 'tis not I only, but all who appreciate, and that if they were here must respect you." "I prefer respect to admiration," said Flora, "but I fear that respect is not the appanage of such as I am." "All must respect those who respect themselves," said Coningsby. "Adieu, mademoiselle. I trust to morrow to hear that you are yourself." He bowed to Villebecque and retired. In the meantime affairs in the drawing room assumed a very different character from those behind the scenes. Coningsby returned to brilliancy, groups apparently gushing with light-heartedness, universal content, and Russian dances. "And you too, do you dance the Russian dances, Mr. Coningsby?" said Madame Colonna. "I cannot dance at all," said Coningsby, beginning a little to lose his pride in the want of an accomplishment which at Eton he had thought it spirited to despise. "Ah, you cannot dance the Russian dances! Lucretia shall teach you," said the Princess. "Nothing will please her so much." On the present occasion The ladies were not so experienced in the entertainment as the gentlemen, but there was amusement in being instructed. To be disciplined by a Grand Duke or a Russian Princess was all very well, but what even a good-tempered Lady Gaythorpe could not pardon was that a certain Mrs. Guy Flouncey, whom they were all of them trying to put down and to keep down, on this, as on almost every other occasion, proved herself a more finished performer than even the Russians themselves. Lord Monmouth had picked up the Guy Flounceys during a Roman winter. They were people of some position in society. Mr. Guy Flouncey was a man of good estate, a sportsman, proud of his pretty wife. Mrs. Guy Flouncey was even very pretty, dressed in a style of ultra fashion. However, she could sing, dance, act, ride and talk, and all well, and was mistress of the art of flirtation. She had amused the Marquis abroad, and had taken care to call at Monmouth House the instant the Morning Post apprised her he had arrived in England. The consequence was an invitation to Coningsby. She came with a wardrobe which, in point of variety, fancy, and fashion, never was surpassed. Morning and evening, every day a new dress equally striking, and a riding habit that was the talk and wonder of the whole neighbourhood. Mrs. Guy Flouncey created far more sensation in the borough when she rode down the High Street than what the good people called the real princesses. At first the fine ladies never noticed her, or only stared at her over their shoulders. Everywhere sounded, in suppressed whispers, the fatal question, "Who is she?" After dinner they formed always into polite groups, from which Mrs. Guy Flouncey was invariably excluded, and if ever the Princess Colonna, impelled by good nature, and partly from having known her on the Continent, did kindly sit by her, Lady St. Julian's, or some dame equally benevolent, was sure, by an adroit appeal to her Highness on some other point which could not be decided without moving, to withdraw her from her pretty and persecuted companion. It was indeed rather difficult work the first few days for Mrs. Guy Flouncey, especially immediately after dinner. It is not soothing to one's self-love to find oneself sitting alone, pretending to look at prints in a fine drawing-room full of fine people who don't speak to you. But Mrs. Guy Flouncey, after having taken Coningsby Castle by storm, was not to be driven out of its drawing-room by the tactics even of a Lady St. Julian's. Experience convinced her that all that was required was a little patience. Mrs. Guy had confidence in herself, her quickness, her ever-ready accomplishments, and her practised powers of attraction. And she was right. She was always sure of an ally the moment the gentleman appeared. The cavalier who had sat next to her at dinner was only too happy to meet her again. More than once, too, she had caught her noble host, though a whole garrison was ever on the watch to prevent her, and he was greatly amused, and showed that he was greatly amused, by her society. Then she suggested plans to him to divert his guests. In a country house the suggestive mind is inestimable. Somehow or other, before a week passed, Mrs. Guy Flouncey seemed the soul of everything, was always surrounded by a cluster of admirers, and with what are called the best men, ever ready to ride with her, dance with her, act with her, or fall at her feet. The fine ladies found it absolutely necessary to thaw. They began to ask her questions after dinner. Mrs. Guy Flouncey only wanted an opening. She was an adroit flatterer, with a temper imperturbable, and gifted with a ceaseless energy of conferring slight obligations. She lent them patterns for new fashions, in all which mysteries she was very versant, and what with some gentle glozing and some gay gossip, sugar for their tongues and salt for their tails, she contrived pretty well to catch them all. End of chapter 8. Section 16 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 9. Nothing could present a greater contrast than the respective interiors of Coningsby and Beaumanoir. That air of habitual habitation which so pleasingly distinguished the Duke's family seat was entirely wanting at Coningsby. Everything indeed was vast and splendid, but it seemed rather a gala house than a dwelling, as if the grand furniture and the grand servants had all come down express from town with the grand company, and were to disappear and to be dispersed at the same time. And truly there were manifold traces of hasty and temporary arrangement, new carpets and old hangings, old paint, new gilding, battalions of odd French chairs, squadrons of queer English tables, and large tasteless lamps and tawdry chandeliers, evidently true cockneys, and only taking the air by way of change. There was, too, throughout the drawing-rooms an absence of all those minor articles of ornamental furniture that are the offering of taste to the home we love. There were no books neither, few flowers, no pet animals, no portfolios of fine drawings by our English artists like the album of the Duchess, full of sketches by Landseer and Stanfield, and their gifted brethren. Not a print even, except portfolios of H.B.'s caricatures. The modes and manners of the house were not rural. There was nothing of the sweet order of a country life. Nobody came down to breakfast. The ladies were scarcely seen till dinner-time. They rolled about in carriages together late in the afternoon, as if they were in London, or led a sort of factitious boudoir life in their provincial dressing-rooms. The Marquess sent for Coningsby the morning after his arrival, and asked him to breakfast with him in his private rooms. Nothing could be more kind or more agreeable than his grandfather. He appeared to be interested in his grandson's progress, was glad to find Coningsby had distinguished himself at Eton, solemnly adjured him not to neglect his French. A classical education, he said, was a very admirable thing, and one which all gentlemen should enjoy. But Coningsby would find some day that there were two educations, one which his position required, another which was demanded by the world. French, my dear Harry, he continued, is the key to this second education. In a couple of years or so you will enter the world. It is a different thing to what you read about. It is a masquerade, a motley, sparkling multitude, in which you may mark all forms and colours, and listen to all sentiments and opinions, but where all you see and hear has only one object, plunder. When you get into this crowd, you will find that Greek and Latin are not so much diffused as you imagine. I was glad to hear you speaking French yesterday. Study your accent. There are a good many foreigners here with whom you may try your wing a little. Don't talk to any of them too much. Be very careful of intimacies. All the people here are good acquaintance, at least pretty well. Now here, said the Marquess, taking up a letter, and then throwing it down on the table again, now here is a man whom I should like you to know, Sidonia. He will be here in a few days. Lay yourself out for him if you have the opportunity. He is a man of rare capacity and enormously rich. No one knows the world like Sidonia. I never met his equal, and 'tis so pleasant to talk with one who can want nothing of you. Lord Monmouth had invited Coningsby to take a drive with him in the afternoon. The Marquess wished to show a part of his domain to the ambassadress. Only Lucretia, he said, would be with them, and there was a place for him. This invitation was readily accepted by Coningsby, who was not yet sufficiently established in the habits of the house exactly to know how to pass his morning. His friend and patron, Mr. Rigby, was entirely taken up with the Grand Duke, whom he was accompanying all over the neighbourhood, in visits to manufactures, many of which Rigby himself saw for the first time, but all of which he fluently explained to his Imperial Highness. In return for this he extracted much information from the Grand Duke on Russian plans and projects, materials for a slashing article against the Russophobia that he was preparing, and in which he was to prove that Muscovite aggression was an English interest and entirely to be explained by the want of sea-coast which drove the Tsar for the pure purposes of commerce to the Baltic and the Euxine. When the hour for the drive arrived, Coningsby found Lucretia, a young girl when he had first seen her only 4 years back, and still his junior, in that majestic dame who had conceded a superb recognition to him the preceding eve. She really looked older than Madame Colonna, who, very beautiful, very young-looking, and mistress of the real arts of the toilet, those that cannot be detected, was not in the least altered since she first so cordially saluted Coningsby as her dear young friend at Monmouth House. The day was delightful, the park extensive and picturesque, the ambassadress sparkling with anecdote, and occasionally in a low voice breathing a diplomatic hint to Lord Monmouth, who bowed his graceful consciousness of her distinguished confidence. Coningsby occasionally took advantage of one of those moments when the conversation ceased to be general, to address Lucretia, who replied in calm, fine smiles and in affable monosyllables. She indeed generally succeeded in conveying an impression to those she addressed that she had never seen them before, did not care to see them now, and never wished to see them again. And all this, too, with an air of great courtesy. They arrived at the brink of a wooded bank. At their feet flowed a fine river, deep and rushing, though not broad, its opposite bank the boundary of a richly timbered park. "Ah, this is beautiful!" exclaimed the ambassadress. "And is that yours, Lord Monmouth?" "Not yet," said the Marquess. "This is Hellingsley. It is one of the finest places in the county, with a splendid estate. Not so considerable as Coningsby, but very great. It belongs to a very old man without a relative in the world. It is known that the estate will be sold at his death, which may be almost daily expected. Then it is mine. No one can offer for it what I can afford. For it gives me this division of the county, Princess. To possess Hellingsley is one of my objects." The Marquess spoke with an animation unusual with him, almost with a degree of excitement. The wind met them as they returned, the breeze blew rather freshly. Lucretia all of a sudden seemed touched with unusual emotion. She was alarmed lest Lord Monmouth should catch cold. She took a kerchief from her own well-turned throat to tie round his neck. He feebly resisted, evidently much pleased. The Princess Lucretia was highly accomplished. In the evening, having refused several distinguished guests, but instantly yielding to the request of Lord Monmouth, she sang. It was impossible to conceive a contralto of more thrilling power, or an execution more worthy of the voice. Coningsby, who was not experienced in fine singing, listened as if to a supernatural lay, but all agreed that it was of the highest class of nature and of art, and the Grand Duke was in raptures. Lucretia received even his Highness's compliments with a graceful indifference. Indeed, to those who watched her demeanour, it might be remarked that she seemed to yield to none, although all bowed before her. Madame Colonna, who was always kind to Coningsby, expressed to him her gratification from the party of the morning. It must have been delightful, she assured Coningsby, for Lord Monmouth to have both Lucretia and his grandson with him. And Lucretia, too, she added, must have been so pleased. Coningsby could not make out why Madame Colonna was always intimating to him that the Princess Lucretia took such interest in his existence, looked forward with such gratification to his society, remembered with so much pleasure the past, anticipated so much happiness from the future. It appeared to him that he was to Lucretia, if not an object of repugnance, as he sometimes fancied, certainly one only of absolute indifference. But he said nothing. He had already lived long enough to know that it is unwise to wish everything explained. In the meantime his life was agreeable. Every day, he found, added to his acquaintance. He was never without a companion to ride or to shoot with, and of riding Coningsby was very fond. His grandfather, too, was continually giving him good-natured turns, and making him of consequence in the castle, so that all the guests were fully impressed with the importance of Lord Monmouth's grandson. Lady St. Julians pronounced him distinguished. The ambassadress thought diplomacy should be his part, as he had a fine person and a clear brain. Madame Colonna spoke of him always as if she took intense interest in his career, and declared she liked him almost as much as Lucretia did. The Russians persisted in always styling him the young Marquess, notwithstanding the ambassador's explanations. Mrs. Guy Flouncey made a dashing attack on him, but Coningsby remembered a lesson which Lady Everingham had graciously bestowed on him. He was not to be caught again easily. Besides, Mrs. Guy Flouncey laughed a little too much and talked a little too loud. As time flew on, there were changes of visitors, chiefly among the single men. At the end of the first week after Coningsby's arrival, Lord Eskdale appeared, bringing with him Lucian Gay, and soon after followed the Marquis of Beaumanoir and Mr. Melton. These were all heroes who, in their way, interested the ladies, and whose advent was hailed with general satisfaction. Even Lucretia would relax a little to Lord Eskdale. He was one of her oldest friends, and with a simplicity of manner which amounted almost to plainness, and with rather a cynical nonchalance in his carriage towards men, Lord Eskdale was invariably a favourite with women. To be sure, his station was eminent. He was noble and very rich and very powerful, and these are qualities which tell as much with the softer as the harsher sex. But there are individuals with all these qualities who are nevertheless unpopular with women. Lord Eskdale was easy, knew the world thoroughly, had no prejudices, and above all had a reputation for success. A reputation for success has as much influence with women as a reputation for wealth has with men. Both reputations may be, and often are, unjust, but we see persons daily make good fortunes by them all the same. Lord Eskdale was not an impostor, and though he might not have been so successful a man had he not been Lord Eskdale, still, thrown over by a revolution, he would have lighted on his legs. The arrival of this nobleman was the occasion of giving a good turn to poor Flora. He went immediately to see his friend Villebecque and his troop. Indeed, it was a sort of society which pleased Lord Eskdale more than that which is deemed more refined. He was very sorry about La Petite, but thought that everything would come right in the long run, and told Villebecque that he was glad to hear him well spoken of here, especially by the Marquis, who seemed to take to him. As for Flora, he was entirely against her attempting the stage again, at least for the present, but as she was a good musician, he suggested to the Princess Lucretia one night that the subordinate aid of Flora might be of service to her, and permit her to favour her friends with some pieces which otherwise she must deny to them. This suggestion was successful. Flora was introduced occasionally, soon often, to their parties in the evening, and her performances were in every respect satisfactory. There was nothing to excite the jealousy of Lucretia, either in her style or her person. And yet she sang well enough, and was a quiet, refined, retiring, by no means disagreeable person. She was the companion of Lucretia very often in the morning, as well as in the illumined saloon, for the princess was devoted to the art in which she excelled. This connection on the whole contributed to the happiness of poor Flora. True it was, in the evening she often found herself sitting or standing alone, and no one noticing her. She had no dazzling quality to attract men of fashion, who themselves loved to worship ever the fashionable. Even their goddesses must be à la mode. But Coningsby never omitted an opportunity to show Flora some kindness under these circumstances. He always came and talked to her, and praised her singing, and would sometimes hand her refreshments, and give her his arm if necessary. These slight attentions, coming from the grandson of Lord Monmouth, were for all the world redoubled in their value, though Flora thought only of their essential kindness. All in character with that first visit which dwelt on the poor girl's memory, though it had long ago escaped that of her visitor. For in truth Coningsby had no other impulse for his conduct but kind-heartedness. Thus we have attempted to give some faint idea how life glided away at the Castle the first fortnight that Coningsby passed there. Perhaps we ought not to omit that Mrs. Guy Flouncey, to the infinite disgust of Lady St. Julians, who had a daughter with her, successfully entrapped the devoted attentions of the young Marquis of Beaumanoir, who was never very backward if a lady would take trouble enough, while his friend Mr. Melton, whose barren homage to Lady St. Julians wished her daughter ever particularly to shun, employed all his gaiety, good humour, frivolity, and fashion in amusing that young lady, and with irresistible effect. For the rest, they continued, though they had only partridges to shoot, to pass the morning without weariness. The weather was fine, the stud numerous, all might be mounted. The Grand Duke and his suite, guided by Mr. Rigby, had always some objects to visit, and railroads returned them just in time for the banquet, with an appetite which they had earned, and during which Rigby recounted their achievements and his own options. The dinner was always first-rate. The evening never failed. Music, dancing, and the theatre offered great resources independently of the soul-subduing sentiment harshly called flirtation, and which is the spell of a country house. Lord Monmouth was satisfied, for he had scarcely ever felt wearied. All that he required in life was to be amused, and perhaps that was not all he required, but it was indispensable. Nor was it wonderful that on the present occasion he obtained his purpose, for there were 100 of the brightest eyes and quickest brains ever on the watch or the whirl to secure him distraction. The only circumstance that annoyed him was the non-arrival of Sidonia. Lord Monmouth could not bear to be disappointed. He could not refrain from saying, notwithstanding all the resources and all the exertions of his guests, "I cannot understand why Sidonia does not come. I wish Sidonia were here." "So do I," said Lord Eskdale. "Sidonia is the only man who tells one anything new." "We saw Sidonia at Lord Studcaster's," said Lord Beaumanoir. "He told Melton he was coming here." "You know he has bought all Studcaster's horses," said Mr. Melton. "I wonder he does not buy Studcaster himself," said Lord Monmouth. "I would, if I were he. Sidonia can buy anything." He turned to Mrs. Guy Flouncey. "I wonder who Sidonia is," thought Mrs. Guy Flouncey, but she was determined no one should suppose she did not know. At length one day Coningsby met Madame Colonna in the vestibule before dinner. "Milor is in such good temper, Mr. Coningsby," she said. "Monsieur de Sidonia has arrived." About 10 minutes before dinner there was a stir in the chamber. Coningsby looked round. He saw the Grand Duke advancing, and holding out his hand in a manner the most gracious. A gentleman of distinguished air, but with his back turned to Coningsby, was bowing as he received his Highness's greeting. There was a general pause in the room. Several came forward. Even the Marquess seemed a little moved. Coningsby could not resist the impulse of curiosity to see this individual of whom he had heard so much. He glided round the room, and caught the countenance of his companion in the Forest Inn. He who announced to him that the age of ruins was past. Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Sidonia was descended from a very ancient and noble family of Aragon, that in the course of ages had given to the state many distinguished citizens. In the priesthood its members had been peculiarly eminent. Besides several prelates, they counted among their number an Archbishop of Toledo, and a Sidonia, in a season of great danger and difficulty, had exercised for a series of years the paramount officer of Grand Inquisitor. Yet, strange as it may sound, it is nevertheless a fact, of which there is no lack of evidence, that this illustrious family during all this period, in common with 2/3 of the Aragonese nobility, secretly adhered to the ancient faith and ceremonies of their fathers, a belief in the unity of the God of Sinai and the rites and observances of the laws of Moses. Whence came these Mosaic Arabs, whose passages across the strait from Africa to Europe long preceded the invasion of the Mohammedan Arabs, it is now impossible to ascertain. Their traditions tell us that from time immemorial they had sojourned in Africa, and it is not improbable that they may have been the descendants of some of the earlier dispersions, like those Hebrew colonies that we find in China, and who probably emigrated from Persia in the days of the great monarchies. Whatever may have been their origin in Africa, their fortunes in southern Europe are not difficult to trace, though the annals of no race in any age can detail a history of such strange vicissitudes, or one rife with more touching and romantic incident. Their unexampled prosperity in the Spanish peninsula, and especially in the south, where they had become the principal cultivators of the soil, excited the jealousy of the Goths, and the councils of Toledo during the 6th and 7th centuries attempted, by a series of decrees worthy of the barbarians who promulgated them, to root the Jewish Arabs out of the land. There is no doubt the Council of Toledo led, as directly as the lust of Roderick, to the invasion of Spain by the Moslem Arabs. The Jewish population, suffering under the most sanguinary and atrocious persecution, looked to their sympathizing brethren of the Crescent, whose camps already gleamed on the opposite shore. The overthrow of the Gothic kingdoms was as much achieved by the superior information which the Saracens received from their suffering kinsmen as by the resistless valour of the desert. The Saracen kingdoms were established. That fair and unrivalled civilization arose which preserved for Europe arts and letters when Christendom was plunged in darkness. The children of Ishmael rewarded the children of Israel with equal rights and privileges with themselves. During these halcyon centuries, it is difficult to distinguish the follower of Moses from the votary of Mahomet. Both alike built palaces, gardens, and fountains, filled equally the highest offices of the state, competed in an extensive and enlightened commerce, and rivalled each other in renowned universities. Even after the fall of the principal Moorish kingdoms, the Jews of Spain were still treated by the conquering Goths with tenderness and consideration. Their numbers, their wealth, the fact that in Aragon especially they were the proprietors of the soil, and surrounded by warlike and devoted followers, secured for them a usage which for a considerable period made them little sensible of the change of dynasties and religions. But the tempest gradually gathered. As the Goths grew stronger, persecution became more bold. Where the Jewish population was scanty, they were deprived of their privileges, or obliged to conform under the title of Nuevos Cristianos. At length the union of the two crowns under Ferdinand and Isabella, and the fall of the last Moorish kingdom, brought the crisis of their fate both to the new Christians and the nonconforming Hebrew. The Inquisition appeared, the institution that had exterminated the Albigenses and had desolated Languedoc, and which, it should ever be remembered, was established in the Spanish kingdoms against the protests of the Cortes and amid the terror of the populace. The Dominicans opened their first tribunal at Seville, and it is curious that the first individuals they summoned before them were the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Marquis of Cadiz, and the Count of Arcos, three of the most considerable personages in Spain. How many were burned alive at Seville during the first year? How many imprisoned for life? What countless thousands were visited with severe though lighter punishments need not be recorded here. In nothing was the Holy Office more happy than in multiform and subtle means by which they tested the sincerity of the new Christians. At length the Inquisition was to be extended to Aragon. The high-spirited nobles of that kingdom knew that its institution was for them a matter of life or death. The Cortes of Aragon appealed to the king and to the Pope. They organised an extensive conspiracy. The chief inquisitor was assassinated in the cathedral of Saragossa. Alas! It was fated that in this, one of the many and continuing struggles between the rival organizations of the North and the South, the children of the sun should fall. The faggot and the San Benito were the doom of the nobles of Aragon. Those who were convicted of secret Judaism, and this scarcely 3 centuries ago, were dragged to the stake. The sons of the noblest houses, in whose veins the Hebrew taint could be traced, had to walk in solemn procession, singing psalms and confessing their faith in the religion of the fell Torquemada. This triumph in Aragon, the almost simultaneous fall of the last Moorish kingdom, raised the hopes of the pure Christians to the highest pitch. Having purged the new Christians, they next turned their attention to the old Hebrews. Ferdinand was resolved that the delicious air of Spain should be breathed no longer by anyone who did not profess the Catholic faith. Baptism or exile was the alternative. More than 600,000 individuals, some authorities greatly increased the amount, the most industrious, the most intelligent, and the most enlightened of Spanish subjects, would not desert the religion of their fathers. For this they gave up the delightful land wherein they had lived for centuries, the beautiful cities they had raised, the universities from which Christendom drew for ages its most precious lore, the tombs of their ancestors, the temples where they had worshipped the God for whom they had made this sacrifice. They had but 4 months to prepare for eternal exile after a residence of as many centuries, during which brief period forced sales and glutted markets virtually confiscated their property. It is a calamity that the scattered nation still ranks with the desolations of Nebuchadnezzar and of Titus. Who after this should say the Jews are by nature a sordid people? But the Spanish Goth, then so cruel and so haughty, where is he? A despised suppliant to the very race which he banished for some miserable portion of the treasure which the habits of industry have again accumulated. Where is that tribunal that summoned Medina Sidonia and Cadiz to its dark inquisition? Where is Spain? Where is Spain? Its fall, its unparalleled and its irremediable fall, is mainly to be attributed to the expulsion of that large portion of its subjects, the most industrious and intelligent, who traced their origin to the Mosaic and the Mohammedan Arabs. The Sidonians of Aragon were nuevos Christianos. Some of them, no doubt, were burned alive at the end of the 15th century under the system of Torquemada. Many of them, doubtless, wore the San Benito, but they kept their titles and estates, and in time reached those great offices to which we have referred. During the long disorders of the Peninsular War, when so many openings were offered to talent and so many opportunities seized by the adventurous, a cadet of a younger branch of this family made a large fortune by military contracts, and supplying the commissariat of the different armies. At the peace, prescient of the great financial future of Europe, confident in the fertility of his own genius, in his original views of fiscal subjects, and his knowledge of national resources, this Sidonia, feeling that Madrid or even Cadiz could never be a base on which the monetary transactions of the world could be regulated, resolved to emigrate to England, with which he had, in the course of years, formed considerable commercial connections. He arrived there after the Peace of Paris with his large capital. He staked all he was worth on the Waterloo loan, and the event made him one of the greatest capitalists in Europe. No sooner was Sidonia established in England than he professed Judaism, which Torquemada flattered himself, with the faggot and the San Benito, he had drained out of the veins of his family more than 3 centuries ago. He sent over also, for several of his brothers, who were as good Catholics in Spain as Ferdinand and Isabella could have possibly desired, but who made an offering in the synagogue in gratitude for their safe voyage on their arrival in England. Sidonia had foreseen in Spain that after the exhaustion of a war of 25 years, Europe must require capital to carry on peace. He reaped the due reward of his sagacity. Europe did require money, and Sidonia was ready to lend it to Europe. France wanted some, Austria more, Prussia a little, Russia a few millions. Sidonia could furnish them all. The only country which he avoided was Spain. He was too well acquainted with its resources. Nothing, too, would ever tempt him to lend anything to the revolted colonies of Spain. Prudence saved him from being a creditor of the mother country. His Spanish pride recoiled from the rebellion of her children. It is not difficult to conceive that after having pursued the career we have intimated for about 10 years, Sidonia had become one of the most considerable personages in Europe. He had established a brother, or a near relative, in whom he could confide, in most of the principal capitals. He was lord and master of the money market of the world, and of course virtually lord and master of everything else. He literally held the revenues of southern Italy in pawn, and monarchs and ministers of all countries courted his advice and were guided by his suggestions. He was still in the vigour of life, and was not a mere money-making machine. He had a general intelligence equal to his position, and looked forward to the period when some relaxation from his vast enterprises and exertions might enable him to direct his energies to great objects of public benefit. But in the height of his vast prosperity he suddenly died, leaving only one child, a youth still of tender years, an heir to the greatest fortune in Europe, so great indeed that it could only be calculated by millions. Shut out from universities and schools, those universities and schools which were indebted for their first knowledge of ancient philosophy to the learning and enterprise of his ancestors, the young Sidonia was fortunate in the tutor whom his father had procured for him, and who devoted to his charge all the resources of his trained intellect and vast and varied erudition. A Jesuit before the Revolution, since then an exiled liberal leader, now a member of the Spanish Cortes, Rebello was always a Jew. He found in his pupil that precocity of intellectual development which is characteristic of the Arabian organisation. The young Sidonia penetrated the highest mysteries of mathematics with a facility almost instinctive, while a memory, which never had any twilight hours, but always reflected a noontide clearness, seemed to magnify his acquisitions of ancient learning by the promptness with which they could be reproduced and applied. The circumstances of his position, too, had early contributed to give him an unusual command over the modern languages. An Englishman, and taught from his cradle to be proud of being an Englishman, he first evinced in speaking his native language those remarkable powers of expression, and that clear and happy elocution which ever afterwards distinguished him. But the son of a Spaniard, the sonorous syllables of that noble tongue constantly resounded in his ear, while the foreign guests who thronged his father's mansion habituated him from an early period of life to the tones of languages that were not long strange to him. When he was 19, Sidonia, who had then resided some time with his uncle at Naples, and had made a long visit to another of his father's relatives at Frankfort, possessed a complete mastery over the principal European languages. At 17 he had parted with Rebello, who returned to Spain, and Sidonia, under the control of his guardians, commenced his travels. He resided, as we have mentioned, some time in Germany, and then, having visited Italy, settled at Naples, at which city it may be said that he made his entrance into life. With an interesting person, and highly accomplished, he availed himself of the gracious attentions of a court of which he was the principal creditor, and which, treating him as a distinguished English traveller, were enabled perhaps to show him some favours that the manners of the country might not have permitted them to accord to his Neapolitan relatives. Sidonia thus obtained at an early age that experience of refined and luxurious society which is a necessary part of a finished education. It gives the last polish to the manners. It teaches us something of the power of the passions, early developed in the hotbed of self-indulgence. It instills into us that indefinable tact seldom obtained in later life, which prevents us from saying the wrong thing, and often impels us to do the right. Between Paris and Naples, Sidonia passed 2 years, spent apparently in the dissipation which was perhaps inseparable from his time of life. He was admired by women, to whom he was magnificent, idolized by artists whom he patronized, received in all circles with great distinction, and appreciated for his intellect by the very few to whom he at all opened himself. For though affable and gracious, it was impossible to penetrate him. Though unreserved in his manner, his frankness was strictly limited to the surface. He observed everything, thought ever, but avoided serious discussion. If you pressed him for an opinion, he took refuge in raillery, or threw out some grave paradox with which it was not easy to cope. The moment he came of age, Sidonia, having previously, at a great family congress held at Naples, made arrangements with the heads of the houses that bore his name respecting the disposition and management of his vast fortune, quitted Europe. Sidonia was absent from his connections for 5 years, during which period he never communicated with them. They were aware of his existence only by the orders which he drew on them for payment, and which arrived from all quarters of the globe. It would appear from these documents that he had dwelt a considerable time in the Mediterranean regions, penetrated Nilotic Africa to Sennar and Abyssinia, traversed the Asiatic continent to Tartary, whence he had visited Hindustan and the isles of that Indian Sea which are so little known. Afterwards he was heard of at Valparaiso, the Brazils, and Lima. He evidently remained some time in Mexico, which he quitted for the United States. One morning, without notice, he arrived in London. Sidonia had exhausted all the sources of human knowledge. He was master of the learning of every nation, of all tongues dead or living, of every literature, Western and Oriental. He had pursued the speculations of science to their last term, and had himself illustrated them by observation and experiment. He had lived in all orders of society, had viewed every combination of nature and of art, and had observed man under every phasis of civilization. He had even studied him in the wilderness. The influence of creeds and laws, manners, customs, traditions, in all their diversities, had been subjected to his personal scrutiny. He brought to the study of this vast aggregate of knowledge a penetrative intellect, that, matured by long meditation, and assisted by that absolute freedom from prejudice which was the compensatory possession of a man without a country, permitted Sidonia to fathom, as it were by intuition, the depth of questions apparently the most difficult and profound. He possessed the rare faculty of communicating with precision ideas the most abstruse, and in general a power of expression which arrests and satisfies attention. With all this knowledge, which no one knew more to prize, with boundless wealth, and with an athletic frame which sickness had never tried, and which had avoided excess, Sidonia nevertheless looked upon life with a glance rather of curiosity than content. His religion walled him out from the pursuits of a citizen. His riches deprived him of the stimulating anxieties of a man. He perceived himself a lone being, alike without cares and without duties. To a man in his position, there might yet seem one unfailing source of felicity and joy, independent of creed, independent of country, independent even of character. He might have discovered that perpetual spring of happiness in the sensibility of the heart. But this was a sealed fountain to Sidonia. In his organisation there was a peculiarity, perhaps a great deficiency. He was a man without affections. It would be harsh to say that he had no heart, for he was susceptible of deep emotions, but not for individuals. He was capable of rebuilding a town that was burned down, of restoring a colony that had been destroyed by some awful visitation of nature, of redeeming to liberty a horde of captives, and of doing these great acts in secret, for, void of all self-love, public approbation was worthless to him, but the individual never touched him. Woman was to him a toy, man a machine. The lot the most precious to man, and which a beneficent Providence has made not the least common, to find in another heart a perfect and profound sympathy, to unite his existence with one who could share all his joys, soften all his sorrows, aid him in all his projects, respond to all his fancies, counsel him in his cares, and support him in his perils, make life charming by her charms, interesting by her intelligence, and sweet by the vigilant variety of her tenderness. To find your life blessed by such an influence, and to feel that your influence can bless such a life, this lot, the most divine of divine gifts, that power and even fame can never rival in its delights, all this nature had denied to Sidonia. With an imagination as fiery as his native desert, and an intellect as luminous as his native sky, he wanted, like the land, those softening dews without which the soil is barren, and the sunbeam is often a messenger of pestilence as an angel of regenerative grace. Such a temperament, though rare, is peculiar to the East. It inspired the founders of the great monarchies of antiquity, the prophets that the desert has sent forth, the Tartar chiefs who have overrun the world. It might be observed in the great Corsican, who, like most of the inhabitants of the Mediterranean isles, had probably Arab blood in his veins. It is a temperament that befits conquerors and legislators, but in ordinary times and ordinary situations entails on its possessor only eccentric aberrations or profound melancholy. The only human quality that interested Sidonia was intellect. He cared not whence it came, where it was to be found. Creed, country, class, character, in this respect, were alike indifferent to him. The author, the artist, the man of science, never appealed to him in vain. Often he anticipated their wants and wishes. He encouraged their society, was as frank in his conversation as he was generous in his contributions. But the instant they ceased to be authors, artists, or philosophers, and their communications arose from anything but the intellectual quality which had originally interested him, the moment they were rash enough to approach intimacy and appeal to the sympathizing man instead of the congenial intelligence, he saw them no more. It was not, however, intellect merely in these unquestionable shapes that commanded his notice. There was not an adventurer in Europe with whom he was not familiar. No minister of state had such communication with secret agents and political spies as Sidonia. He held relations with all the clever outcasts of the world. The catalogue of his acquaintance in the shape of Greeks, Armenians, Moors, secret Jews, Tartars, Gypsies, wandering Poles, and Carbonari would throw a curious light on those subterranean agencies of which the world in general knows so little, but which exercise so great an influence on public events. His extensive travels, his knowledge of languages, his daring and adventurous disposition, and his unlimited means, had given him opportunities of becoming acquainted with these characters, in general so difficult to trace, and of gaining their devotion. To these sources he owed that knowledge of strange and hidden things which often startled those who listened to him. Nor was it easily, scarcely possible, to deceive him. Information reached him from so many and such contrary quarters that with his discrimination and experience he could almost instantly distinguish the truth. The secret history of the world was his pastime. His great pleasure was to contrast the hidden motive with the public pretext of transactions. One source of interest Sidonia found in his descent and in the fortunes of his race. As firm in his adherence to the code of the great legislator as if the trumpet still sounded on Sinai, he might have received in the conviction of divine favour an adequate compensation for human persecution. But there were other and more terrestrial considerations that made Sidonia proud of his origin and confident in the future of his kind. Sidonia was a great philosopher who took comprehensive views of human affairs and surveyed every fact in its relative position to other facts, the only mode of obtaining truth. Sidonia was well aware that in the 5 great varieties into which physiology has divided the human species, to wit, the Caucasian, the Mongolian, the Malayan, the American, the Ethiopian, the Arabian tribes rank in the first and superior class, together, among others, with the Saxon and the Greek. This fact alone is the source of great pride and satisfaction to the animal man. But Sidonia and his brethren could claim a distinction which the Saxon and the Greek and the rest of the Caucasian nations have forfeited. The Hebrew is an unmixed race. Doubtless among the tribes who inhabit the bosom of the desert, progenitors alike of the Mosaic and the Mohammedan Arabs, blood may be found as pure as that of the descendants of the Sheikh Abraham. but the Mosaic Arabs are the most ancient, if not the only, unmixed blood that dwells in cities. An unmixed race of a first-rate organization are the aristocracy of nature. Such excellence is a positive fact, not an imagination, a ceremony coined by poets, blazoned by cozening heralds, but perceptible in its physical advantages and in the vigour of its unsullied idiosyncrasy. In his comprehensive travels, Sidonia had visited and examined the Hebrew communities of the world. He had found in general the lower orders debased, the superior immersed in sordid pursuits, but he perceived that the intellectual development was not impaired. This gave him hope. He was persuaded that organization would outlive persecution. When he reflected on what they had endured, it was only marvellous that the race had not disappeared. They had defied exile, massacre, spoliation, the degrading influence of the constant pursuit of gain. They had defied time. For nearly 3,000 years, according to Archbishop Usher, they have been dispersed over the globe. To the unpolluted current of their Caucasian structure, and to the segregating genius of their great lawgiver, Sidonia ascribed the fact that they had not been long ago absorbed among those mixed races who presume to persecute them, but who periodically wear away and disappear, while their victims still flourish in all the primeval vigour of the pure Asian breed. Shortly after his arrival in England, Sidonia repaired to the principal courts of Europe, that he might become personally acquainted with the monarchs and ministers of whom he had heard so much. His position ensured him a distinguished reception. His personal qualities immediately made him cherished. He could please, he could do more, he could astonish. He could throw out a careless observation which would make the oldest diplomatist start, a winged word that gained him the consideration, sometimes the confidence, of sovereigns. When he had fathomed the intelligence which governs Europe, and which can only be done by personal acquaintance, he returned to this country. The somewhat hard and literal character of English life suited one who shrank from sensibility and often took refuge in sarcasm. Its masculine vigour and active intelligence occupied and interested his mind. Sidonia, indeed, was exactly the character who would be welcomed in our circles. His immense wealth, his unrivalled social knowledge, his clear, vigorous intellect, the severe simplicity of his manners, frank but neither claiming nor brooking familiarity, and his devotion to field sports, which was the safety valve of his energy, were all circumstances and qualities which the English appreciate and admire. And it may fairly be said of Sidonia that few men were more popular and none less understood. End of chapter 11. Section 17 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 11. At dinner, Coningsby was seated on the same side as Sidonia, and distant from him. There had been therefore no mutual recognition. Another guest had also arrived, Mr. Ormsby. He came straight from London, full of rumours, had seen Tadpole, who, hearing he was on the wing for Coningsby Castle, had taken him into a dark corner of a club and shown him his book, a safe piece of confidence, as Mr. Ormsby was very near-sighted. It was, however, to be received as an undoubted fact that all was right, and somehow or other, before very long, there would be national demonstration of the same. The arrival of Mr. Ormsby, and the news that he bore, gave a political turn to the conversation after the ladies had left the room. "Tadpole wants me to stand for Birmingham," said Mr. Ormsby, gravely. "You!" exclaimed Lord Monmouth, and throwing himself back in his chair, he broke into a real hearty laugh. "Yes, the Conservatives mean to start 2 candidates, a manufacturer they have got, and have written up Tadpole for a West End man." A what? A West End man who will make the ladies patronise their fancy articles. The result of the Reform Bill, then, said Lucian Gay, will be to give Manchester a bishop and Birmingham a dandy. I begin to believe the result will be very different from what we expected, said Lord Monmouth. Mr. Rigby shook his head and was going to prophesy, when Lord Eskdale, who liked talk to be short, and was of opinion that Rigby should keep his amplifications for his slashing articles, put in a brief careless observation which balked his inspiration. "Certainly," said Mr. Ormsby, "when the guns were firing over Vivian's last speech and confession, I never expected to be asked to stand for Birmingham." "Perhaps you may be called up to the other house by the title," said Lucian Gay. "Who knows?" "I agree with Tadpole," said Mr. Ormsby, "that if we only stick to the registration, the country is saved." "Fortunate country," said Sidonia, "that can be saved by a good registration." "I believe, after all, that with property and pluck," said Lord Monmouth, "parliamentary reform is not such a very bad thing." Here several gentlemen began talking at the same time, all agreeing with their host, and proving in their different ways the irresistible influence of property and pluck; property in Lord Monmouth's mind meaning vassals, and pluck a total disregard for public opinion. Mr. Guy Flouncey, who wanted to get into Parliament, but why nobody knew, who had neither political abilities nor political opinions, but had some floating idea that it would get himself and his wife to more balls and dinners, and who was duly ticketed for "a good thing" in the candidate list of the Tadpoles and the Tapers, was of opinion that an immense deal might be done by properly patronising borough races. That was his specific how to prevent revolution. Taking advantage of a pause, Lord Monmouth said, "I should like to know what you think of this question, Sidonia." "I am scarcely a competent judge," he said, as if wishing to disclaim any interference in the conversation, and then added, "but I have been ever of opinion that revolutions are not to be evaded." "Exactly my views," said Mr. Rigby eagerly. "I say it now, I have said it 1,000 times. You may doctor the registration as you like, but you can never get rid of Schedule A." "Is there a person in this room who can now tell us the names of the boroughs in Schedule A?" said Sidonia. "I'm sure I cannot," said Lord Monmouth, "though 6 of them belong to myself." "But the principle," said Mr. Rigby. "They represented a principle." "Nothing else, certainly," said Lucian Gay. "And what principle?" inquired Sidonia. "The principle of nomination." "That is a practice, not a principle," said Sidonia. "Is it a practice that no longer exists?" "You think then," said Lord Eskdale, cutting in before Rigby, "that the Reform Bill has done us no harm?" "It is not the Reform Bill that has shaken the aristocracy of this country, but the means by which that bill was carried," replied Sidonia. "Physical force?" said Lord Eskdale. "Or social power?" said Sidonia. Upon this Mr. Rigby, impatient at any one giving the tone in a political discussion but himself, and chafing under the vigilance of Lord Eskdale, which to him ever appeared only fortuitous, violently assaulted the argument, and astonished several country gentlemen present by its volubility. They at length listened to real eloquence. At the end of a long appeal to Sidonia, that gentleman only bowed his head and said, "Perhaps," and then turning to his neighbour, inquired whether birds were plentiful in Lancashire this season, so that Mr. Rigby was reduced to the necessity of forming the political opinions of Mr. Guy Flouncey. As the gentlemen left the dining room, Coningsby, though at some distance, was observed by Sidonia, who stopped instantly, then advanced to Coningsby, and, extending his hand, said, "I said we should meet again, though I hardly expected so quickly." "And I hope we shall not separate so soon," said Coningsby. "I was much struck with what you said just now about the Reform Bill. Do you know, the more I think, the more I am perplexed by what is meant by representation?" "It is a principle of which a limited definition is only current in this country," said Sidonia, quitting the room with him. People may be represented without periodical elections of neighbours who are incapable to maintain their interests, and strangers who are unwilling. The entrance of the gentlemen produced the same effect on the saloon as sunrise on the world. Universal animation, a general though gentle stir. The Grand Duke, bowing to every one, devoted himself to the daughter of Lady St. Julians, who herself pinned Lord Beaumanoir before he could reach Mrs. Guy Flouncey. Coningsby instead talked nonsense to that lady. Brilliant cavaliers, including Mr. Melton, addressed a band of beautiful damsels grouped on a large ottoman. Everywhere sounded a delicious murmur, broken occasionally by a silver-sounding laugh not too loud. Sidonia and Lord Eskdale did not join the ladies. They stood for a few moments in conversation, and then threw themselves on a sofa. "Who is that?" asked Sidonia of his companion rather earnestly, as Coningsby quitted them. "'Tis the grandson of Monmouth, young Coningsby." "Ah, the new generation then promises. I met him once before, by chance. He interests me." "They tell me he is a lively lad. He is a prodigious favourite here, and I should not be surprised if Monmouth made him his heir." "I hope he does not dream of inheritance," said Sidonia. "'Tis the most enervating of visions." "Do you admire Lady Augustina St. Julians?" said Mrs. Guy Flouncey to Coningsby. "I admire no one except yourself." "Oh, how very gallant, Mr. Coningsby!" "When should men be gallant, if not to the brilliant and the beautiful?" said Coningsby. "Ah, you are laughing at me." "No, I am not. I am quite grave." "Your eyes laugh. Now tell me, Mr. Coningsby, Lord Henry Sidney is a very great friend of yours?" "Very." "He is very amiable." "Very." "He does a great deal for the poor at Beaumanoir. A very fine place, is it not?" "Very." "As fine as Coningsby?" At present, with Mrs. Guy Flouncey at Coningsby, Beaumanoir would have no chance. "Ah, you laugh at me again. Now tell me, Mr. Coningsby, what do you think we shall do to night? I look upon you, you know, as the real arbiter of our destinies." "You shall decide," said Coningsby. "Mon cher Harry," said Madame Colonna, coming up, "they wish Lucretia to sing, and she will not. You must ask her. She cannot refuse you." "I assure you she can," said Coningsby. "Mon cher Harry, your grandpapa did desire me to beg you to ask her to sing." So Coningsby unwillingly approached Lucretia, who was talking with the Russian ambassador. "I am sent upon a fruitless mission," said Coningsby, looking at her and catching her glance. "What, and why?" she replied. "The mission is to entreat you to do us all a great favour, and the cause of its failure will be that I am the envoy." "If the favour be one to yourself, it is granted; and if you be the envoy, you need never fear failure with me." "I must presume, then, to lead you away," said Coningsby, bending to the ambassador. "Remember," said Lucretia, as they approached the instrument, "that I am singing to you." "It is impossible ever to forget it," said Coningsby, leading her to the piano with great politeness, but only with great politeness. "Where is Mademoiselle Flora?" she inquired. Coningsby found La Petite crouching as it were behind some furniture, and apparently looking over some music. She looked up as he approached, and a smile stole over her countenance. "I am come to ask a favour," he said, and he named his request. "I will sing," she replied, "but only tell me what you like." Coningsby felt the difference between the courtesy of the head and of the heart, as he contrasted the manner of Lucretia and Flora. Nothing could be more exquisitely gracious than the daughter of Colonna was to night. Flora, on the contrary, was rather agitated and embarrassed, and did not express her readiness with half the facility and the grace of Lucretia. But Flora's arm trembled as Coningsby led her to the piano. Meantime Lord Eskdale and Sidonia are in deep converse. "Ah, that is a fine note," said Sidonia, as he looked around. "Who is that singing? Some new protégé of Lord Monmouth?" 'Tis the daughter of the Colonnas, said Lord Eskdale, the Princess Lucretia. Why, she was not at dinner to-day. No, she was not there. My favourite voice, and of all the rarest to be found. When I was a boy it made me almost in love even with Pisaroni. Well, the Princess is scarcely more lovely. 'Tis a pity the plumage is not as beautiful as the note. She is plain. No, not plain with that brow. Well, I rather admire her myself, said Lord Eskdale. She has fine points. Let us approach, said Sidonia. The song ceased. Lord Eskdale advanced, made his compliments, and then said, You were not at dinner to-day. Why should I be? Said the Princess. For our sakes, for mine, if not for your own, said Lord Eskdale, smiling. Your absence has been remarked and felt, I assure you, by others as well as myself. There is my friend Sidonia so enraptured with your thrilling tones that he has abruptly closed a conversation which I have been long counting on. Do you know him? May I present him to you? And having obtained a consent, not often conceded, Lord Eskdale looked round, and calling Sidonia, he presented his friend to the Princess. You are fond of music, Lord Eskdale tells me, said Lucretia. When it is excellent, said Sidonia. But that is so rare, said the Princess. And precious as paradise, said Sidonia. As for indifferent music, 'tis purgatory. But when it is bad, for my part I feel myself. Where? said Lord Eskdale. In the last circle of the Inferno, said Sidonia. Lord Eskdale turned to Flora. And in what circle do you place us who are here? The Princess inquired of Sidonia. One too polished for his verse, replied her companion. You mean too insipid, said the Princess. I wish that life were a little more Dantesque. There is not less treasure in the world, said Sidonia, because we use paper currency, and there is not less passion than of old, though it is bon ton to be tranquil. Do you think so? Said the Princess inquiringly, and then looking around the apartment. Have these automata indeed souls? Some of them, said Sidonia, as many as would have had souls in the 14th century. I thought they were wound up every day, said the Princess. Some are self-impelling, said Sidonia. And you can tell at a glance, inquired the Princess. You are one of those who can read human nature? 'Tis a book open to all. But if they cannot read? Those must be your automata. Lord Monmouth tells me you are a great traveller. I have not discovered a new world. But you have visited it. It is getting old. I would sooner recall the old than discover the new, said the Princess. We have both of us cause, said Sidonia. Our names are the names of the past. I do not love a world of utility, said the Princess. You prefer to be celebrated to being comfortable, said Sidonia. It seems to me that the world is withering under routine. 'Tis the inevitable lot of humanity, said Sidonia. Man must ever be the slave of routine, but in old days it was a routine of great thoughts, and now it is a routine of little ones. The evening glided on, the dance succeeded the song, the ladies were fast vanishing. Coningsby himself was meditating a movement, when Lord Beaumanoir, as he passed him, said, Come to Lucian Gay's room. We are going to smoke a cigar. This was a favourite haunt, towards midnight, of several of the younger members of the party at the Castle, who loved to find relaxation from the decorous gravities of polished life in the fumes of tobacco, the inspiration of whisky toddy, and the infinite amusement of Lucian Gay's conversation and company. This was the genial hour, when the good story gladdened, the pun flashed, and the song sparkled with jolly mirth or saucy mimicry. To-night, being Coningsby's initiation, there was a special general meeting of the Grumpy Club, in which everybody was to say the gayest things with the gravest face, and every laugh carried a forfeit. Lucian was the inimitable president. He told a tale for which he was famous, of the very respectable county family, who had been established in the shire for several generations, but who, it was a fact, had ever been distinguished by the strange and humiliating peculiarity of being born with sheep's tails. The remarkable circumstances under which Lucian Gay had become acquainted with this fact, the traditionary mysteries by which the family in question had succeeded for generations in keeping it secret, the decided measures to which the chief of the family had recourse to stop for ever the rumour when it first became prevalent, and finally the origin and result of the legend, were details which Lucian Gay, with the most rueful countenance, loved to expend upon the attentive and expanding intelligence of a new member of the Grumpy Club. Familiar as all present were with the story, whose stimulus of agonizing visibility they had all in turn experienced, it was with extreme difficulty that any of them could resist the fatal explosion which was to be attended with the dreaded penalty. Lord Beaumanoir looked upon the table with desperate seriousness, an ominous pucker quivering round his lip. Mr. Melton crammed his handkerchief into his mouth with one hand, while he lighted the wrong end of a cigar with the other. One youth hung over the back of his chair, pinching himself like a fakir, while another hid his countenance on the table. "It was at the Hunt dinner," continued Lucian Gay, in an almost solemn tone, "that an idea for a moment was prevalent that Sir Mowbray Cholmondeley Fanshawe, as the head of the family, had resolved to terminate for ever these mysterious aspersions on his race that had circulated in the county for more than 2 centuries. I mean that the highly respectable family of the Cholmondeley Fanshawes had the misfortune to be graced with that appendage to which I have referred. His health being drunk, Sir Mowbray Cholmondeley Fanshawe rose. He was a little unpopular at the moment, from an ugly story about killing foxes, and the guests were not as quiet as orators generally desire. So the honourable baronet paid particular attention to a matter personal to himself. Instantly there was a dead silence." But here Coningsby, who had moved for some time very restlessly on his chair, suddenly started up, and struggling for a moment against the inward convulsion, but in vain, stamped against the floor and gave a shout. "A song from Mr. Coningsby," said the president of the Grumpy Club, amid a universal and now permissible roar of laughter. Coningsby could not sing, so he was to favour them as a substitute with a speech or a sentiment. But Lucian Gay always let one off these penalties easily, and indeed was ever ready to fulfil them for all. Song, speech, or sentiment, he poured them all forth, nor were pastimes more active wanting. He could dance a tarantella like a lazzarone, and execute a cracovienne with all the mincing graces of a ballet heroine. His powers of mimicry, indeed, were great and versatile, but in nothing was he so happy as in a parliamentary debate. And it was remarkable that though himself a man who on ordinary occasions was quite incapable, without infinite perplexity, of publicly expressing his sense of the merest courtesy of society, he was not only a master of the style of every speaker of distinction in either house, but he seemed in his imitative play to appropriate their intellectual as well as their physical peculiarities, and presented you with their mind as well as their manner. There were several attempts to-night to induce Lucian to indulge his guests with a debate, but he seemed to avoid the exertion, which was great. As the night grew old, however, and every hour he grew more lively, he suddenly broke without further pressure into the promised diversion, and Coningsby listened really with admiration to a discussion of which the only fault was that it was more parliamentary than the original, plus arabe que l'Arabie. The Duke was never more curt, nor Sir Robert more specious. He was as fiery as Stanley, and as bitter as Graham. Nor did he do their opponents less justice. Lord Palmerston himself never treated a profound subject with a more pleasant volatility. And when Lucian rose at an early hour of morn, in a full house alike exhausted and excited, and after having endured for hours in sarcastic silence the menacing finger of Sir Robert, shaking over the green table and appealing to his misdeeds in the irrevocable records of Hansard, Lord John himself could not have afforded a more perfect representative of pluck. But loud as was the laughter and vehement the cheering with which Lucian's performances were received, all these ebullitions sank into insignificance compared with the reception which greeted what he himself announced was going to be the speech of the night. Having quaffed full many a quaich of toddy, he insisted on delivering it on the table, a proposition with which his auditors immediately closed. The orator appeared, the great man of the night, who was to answer everybody on both sides. Ah, that harsh voice, that arrogant style, that saucy superficiality which decided on everything, that insolent ignorance that contradicted everybody, it was impossible to mistake them. And Coningsby had the pleasure of seeing reproduced before him the guardian of his youth and the patron of the mimic, the Right Honourable Nicholas Rigby. End of chapter 11. Book 4, Chapter 12. Madame Colonna, with that vivacious energy which characterises the South, had no sooner seen Coningsby and heard his praises celebrated by his grandfather than she resolved that an alliance should sooner or later take place between him and her stepdaughter. She imparted her projects without delay to Lucretia, who received them in a different spirit from that in which they were communicated. Lucretia bore as little resemblance to her stepmother in character as in person. If she did not possess her beauty, she was born with an intellect of far greater capacity and reach. She had a deep judgment. A hasty alliance with a youth, arranged by their mutual relatives, might suit very well the clime and manners of Italy, but Lucretia was well aware that it was altogether opposed to the habits and feelings of this country. She had no conviction either Coningsby would wish to marry her, or, if willing, that his grandfather would sanction such a step in one as yet only on the threshold of the world. Lucretia therefore received the suggestions and proposals of Madame Colonna with coldness and indifference, one might even say contempt, for she neither felt respect for this lady, nor was she sedulous to evince it. Although really younger than Coningsby, Lucretia felt that a woman of 18 is, in all worldly considerations, 10 years older than a youth of the same age. She anticipated that a considerable time might elapse before Coningsby would feel it necessary to seal his destiny by marriage, while, on the other hand, she was not only anxious, but resolved not to delay on her part her emancipation from the galling position in which she very frequently found herself. Lucretia felt rather than expressed these ideas and impressions. She was not naturally communicative, and conversed with no one with less frankness and facility than with her stepmother. Madame Colonna therefore found no reasons in her conversation with Lucretia to change her determination. As her mind was not ingenious, she did not see questions in those various lights which make us at the same time infirm of purpose and tolerant. What she fancied ought to be done, she fancied must be done, for she perceived no middle course or alternative. For the rest, Lucretia's carriage towards her gave her little discomfort. Besides, she herself, though good-natured, was obstinate. Her feelings were not very acute, nothing much vexed her. As long as she had fine dresses, good dinners, and opera boxes, she could bear her plans to be crossed like a philosopher, and her consolation under her unaccomplished devices was her admirable consistency, which always assured her that her projects were wise, though unfulfilled. She broke her purpose to Mr. Rigby, that she might gain not only his adhesion to her views, but his assistance in achieving them. As Madame Colonna, in Mr. Rigby's estimation, exercised more influence over Lord Monmouth than any other individual, faithful to his policy or practice, he agreed with all Madame Colonna's plans and wishes, and volunteered instantly to further them. As for the Prince, his wife never consulted him on any subject, nor did he wish to be consulted. On the contrary, he had no opinion about anything. All that he required was that he should be surrounded by what contributed to his personal enjoyment, that he should never be troubled, and that he should have billiards. He was not inexpert in field sports, rode indeed very well for an Italian, but he never cared to be out of doors, and there was only one room in the interior which passionately interested him. It was where the echoing balls denoted the sweeping hazard or the effective cannonade. That was the chamber where the Prince Colonna literally existed. Half an hour after breakfast he was in the billiard room. He never quitted it until he dressed for dinner, and he generally contrived, while the world were amused or amusing themselves at the comedy or in the dance, to steal down with some congenial sprites to the magical and illumined chamber, and use his cue until bedtime. Faithful to her first impressions, Lucretia had made no difference in her demeanour to Coningsby to that which she offered to the other guests. Polite but uncommunicative, ready to answer, but never originating conversation. She charmed him as little by her manner as by her person, and after some attempts, not very painstaking, to interest her, Coningsby had ceased to address her. The day passed by with only a faint recognition between them, even that sometimes omitted. When, however, Lucretia observed that Coningsby had become one of the most notable persons in the castle, when she heard everywhere of his talents and accomplishments, his beauty and grace and great acquirements, and perceived that he was courted by all, that Lord Monmouth omitted no occasion publicly to evince towards him his regard and consideration, that he seemed generally looked upon in the light of his grandfather's heir, and that Lady St. Julians, more learned in that respect than any lady in the kingdom, was heard more than once to regret she had not brought another daughter with her, Clara Isabella, as well as Augustina, the Princess Lucretia began to imagine that Madame Colonna, after all, might not be so extravagant in her purpose as she had first supposed. She, therefore, surprised Coningsby with the almost affectionate moroseness with which, while she hated to sing, she yet found pleasure in singing for him alone; and it is impossible to say what might not have been the next move in her tactics in this respect, had not the very night on which she had resolved to commence the enchantment of Coningsby introduced her to Sidonia. The Princess Lucretia encountered the dark still glance of the friend of Lord Eskdale. He, too, beheld a woman unlike other women, and with his fine experience, both as a man and a physiologist, felt that he was in the presence of no ordinary organisation. From the evening of his introduction, Sidonia sought the society of the Princess Lucretia. He could not complain of her reserve. She threw out her mind in various and highly cultivated intelligence. He recognised in her a deep and subtle spirit, considerable reading for a woman, habits of thought, and a soul passionate and daring. She resolved to subdue one whose appreciation she had gained, and who had subdued her. The profound meaning and the calm manner of Sidonia combined to quell her spirit. She struggled against the spell. She tried to rival his power, to cope with him, and with the same weapons; but prompt as was her thought, and bright as was its expression, her heart beat in tumult, and with all her apparent serenity, her agitated soul was a prey of absorbing passion. She could not contend with that intelligent yet inscrutable eye, with that manner so full of interest and respect, and yet so tranquil. Besides, they were not on equal terms. Here was a girl contending with a man learned in the world's way. Between Sidonia and Coningsby there at once occurred companionship. The morning after his arrival they went out shooting together. After a long ramble they would stretch themselves on the turf under a shady tree, often by the side of some brook where the cresses grow, that added a luxury to their sporting meal; and then Coningsby would lead their conversation to some subject on which Sidonia would pour out his mind with all that depth of reflection, variety of knowledge, and richness of illustrative memory which distinguished him, and which offered so striking a contrast to the sharp talent, the shallow information, and the worldly cunning that make a Rigby. This fellowship between Sidonia and Coningsby elevated the latter still more in the estimation of Lucretia, and rendered her still more desirous of gaining his good will and opinion. A great friendship seemed to have arisen between them, and the world began to believe that there must be some foundation for Madame Colonna's innuendoes. That lady herself was not in the least alarmed by the attention which Sidonia paid her stepdaughter. It was, of course, well known that Sidonia was not a marrying man. He was, however, a great friend of Mr. Coningsby. His presence in society brought Coningsby and Lucretia more together, and however flattered her daughter might be for the moment by Sidonia's homage, still, as she would ultimately find out, if indeed she ever cared to do so, that Sidonia could only be her admirer, Madame Colonna had no kind of doubt that ultimately Coningsby would be Lucretia's husband, as she had arranged from the first. The Princess Lucretia was a fine horsewoman, though she rarely joined the various riding parties that were daily formed at the castle. Often, indeed, attended only by her groom, she met the equestrians. Now she would ride with Sidonia and Coningsby, and as a female companion was indispensable, she insisted upon La Petite accompanying her. This was a fearful trial for Flora, but she encountered it, encouraged by the kind solicitude of Coningsby, who always seemed her friend. Very shortly after the arrival of Sidonia, the Grand Duke and his suite quitted the castle, which had been his Highness's headquarters during his visits to the manufacturing districts, but no other great change in the assembled company occurred for some little time. End of chapter 12. Section 18 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 13. "You will observe one curious trait," said Sidonia to Coningsby, "in the history of this country. The depository of power is always unpopular. All combine against it. It always falls. Power was deposited in the great barons. The Church, using the king for its instrument, crushed the great barons. Power was deposited in the Church. The king, bribing the Parliament, plundered the Church. Power was deposited in the king. The Parliament, using the people, beheaded the king, expelled the king, changed the king, and finally, for a king, substituted an administrative officer. For 150 years power has been deposited in the Parliament, and for the last 60 or 70 years it has been becoming more and more unpopular. In 1830 it was endeavoured by a reconstruction to regain the popular affection, but in truth, as the Parliament then only made itself more powerful, it has only become more odious. And we see that the barons, the Church, the king, have in turn devoured each other, and that the Parliament, the last devourer, remains, it is impossible to resist the impression that this body also is doomed to be destroyed, and he is a sagacious statesman who may detect in what form and in what quarter the great consumer will arise. You take, then, a dark view of our position. Troubled, not dark. I do not ascribe to political institutions that paramount influence which it is the feeling of this age to attribute to them. The Senate that confronted Brennus in the Forum was the same body that registered in an after age the ribald decrees of a Nero. Trial by jury, for example, is looked upon by all as the palladium of our liberties. Yet a jury, at a very recent period of our own history, the reign of Charles II, was a tribunal as iniquitous as the Inquisition. And a graver expression stole over the countenance of Sidonia as he remembered what the Inquisition had operated on his own race and his own destiny. There are families in this country, he continued, of both the great historical parties, that in the persecution of their houses, the murder and proscription of some of their most illustrious members, found judges as unjust and relentless in an open jury of their countrymen as we did in the conclaves of Madrid and Seville. Where then would you look for hope? In what is more powerful than laws and institutions, and without which the best laws and the most skilful institutions may be a dead letter, or the very means of tyranny in the national character? It is not in the increased feebleness of its institutions that I see the peril of England. It is in the decline of its character as a community. And yet you could scarcely describe this age as an age of corruption? Not of political corruption, but it is an age of social disorganization far more dangerous in its consequences because far more extensive. You may have a corrupt government and a pure community. You may have a corrupt community and a pure administration. Which would you elect? Neither, said Coningsby. I wish to see a people full of faith and a government full of duty. Rely upon it, said Sidonia, that England should think more of the community and less of the government. But tell me, what do you understand by the term national character? A character is an assemblage of qualities. The character of England should be an assemblage of great qualities. But we cannot deny that the English have great virtues. The civilization of 1,000 years must produce great virtues. But we are speaking of the decline of public virtue, not its existence. In what then do you trace that decline? In the fact that the various classes of this country are arrayed against each other. But to what do you attribute those reciprocal hostilities? Not entirely, not even principally, to those economical causes of which we hear so much. I look upon all such as secondary causes, which in a certain degree must always exist, which obtrude themselves in troubled times, and which at all times it is the business of the wise statesman to watch, to regulate, to ameliorate, to modify. I am speaking to elicit truth, not to maintain opinion, said Coningsby, for I have none, he added mournfully. I think, said Sidonia, that there is no error so vulgar as to believe that revolutions are occasioned by economical causes. They come in, doubtless, very often to precipitate a catastrophe. Very rarely do they occasion one. I know no period, for example, when physical comfort was more diffused in England than in 1640. England had a moderate population, a very improved agriculture, a rich commerce, yet she was on the eve of the greatest and most violent changes that she has yet experienced. That was a religious movement. Admit it, the cause, then, was not physical. The imagination of England rose against the government. It proves, then, that when that faculty is astir in a nation, it will sacrifice even physical comfort to follow its impulses. Do you think, then, there is a wild desire for extensive political change in the country? Hardly that. England is perplexed at the present moment, not inventive. That will be the next phasis in her moral state, and to that I wish to draw your thoughts. For myself, while I ascribe little influence to physical causes for the production of this perplexity, I am still less of opinion that it can be removed by any new dispensation of political power. It would only aggravate the evil. That would be recurring to the old error of supposing you can necessarily find national content in political institutions. A political institution is a machine. The motive power is the national character. With that it rests whether the machine will benefit society or destroy it. Society in this country is perplexed, almost paralyzed. In time it will move and it will devise. How are the elements of the nation to be again blended together? In what spirit is that reorganization to take place? To know that would be to know everything. At least let us free ourselves from the double ignorance of the Platonists. Let us not be ignorant that we are ignorant. I have emancipated myself from that darkness for a long time, said Coningsby. Long has my mind been musing over these thoughts, but to me all is still obscurity. In this country, said Sidonia, since the peace, there has been an attempt to advocate a reconstruction of society on a purely rational basis. The principle of utility has been powerfully developed. I speak not with lightness of the labours of the disciples of that school. I bow to intellect in every form, and we should be grateful to any school of philosophers, even if we disagree with them. Doubly grateful in this country, where for so long a period our statesmen were in so pitiable an arrear of public intelligence. There has been an attempt to reconstruct society on a basis of material motives and calculations. It has failed. It must ultimately have failed under any circumstances. Its failure in an ancient and densely peopled kingdom was inevitable. How limited is human reason! The profoundest inquirers are most conscious. We are not indebted to the reason of man for any of the great achievements which are the landmarks of human action and human progress. It was not reason that besieged Troy. It was not reason that sent forth the Saracen from the desert to conquer the world, that inspired the Crusaders, that instituted the monastic orders. It was not reason that produced the Jesuits. Above all, it was not reason that created the French Revolution. Man is only truly great when he acts from the passions, never irresistible but when he appeals to the imagination. Even Mormon counts more votaries than Bentham. And you think, then, that as imagination once subdued the state, imagination may now save it? Man is made to adore and to obey, but if you will not command him, if you give him nothing to worship, he will fashion his own divinities and find a chieftain in his own passions. But where can we find faith in a nation of sectaries? Who can feel loyalty to a sovereign of Downing Street? I speak of the eternal principles of human nature. You answer me with the passing accidents of the hour. Sects rise and sects disappear. Where are the Fifth Monarchy men? England is governed by Downing Street. Once it was governed by Alfred and Elizabeth. End of chapter 13. Book 4, Chapter 14. About this time a steeplechase in the west of England had attracted considerable attention. This sport was then of recent introduction in England, and is in fact an importation of Irish growth, although it has flourished in our soil. A young guardsman, who was then a guest at the castle, and who had been in a garrison in Ireland, had some experience of this pastime in the Kildare country, and he proposed that they should have a steeplechase at Coningsby. This was a suggestion very agreeable to the Marquis of Beaumanoir, celebrated for his feats of horsemanship, and indeed to most of the guests. It was agreed that the race should come off at once, before any of the present company, many of whom gave symptoms of being on the wing, had quitted the castle. The young guardsman and Mr. Guy Flouncey had surveyed the country, and had selected a line which they esteemed very appropriate for the scene of action. From a hill of common land you looked down upon the valley of Coningsby, richly cultivated, deeply ditched, and stiffly fenced. The valley was bounded by another rising ground, and the scene was admirably calculated to give an extensive view to a multitude. The distance along the valley was to be 2 miles out and home again, the starting post being also the winning post, and the flags which were placed on every fence which the horses were to pass were to be passed on the left hand of the rider, both going and coming, so that although the horses had to leap the same fences forward and backward, they could not come over the same place twice. In the last field, before they turned, was a brook 17 feet clear from side to side, with good taking off both banks. Here real business commenced. Lord Monmouth highly approved the scheme, but mentioned that the stakes must be moderate and open to the whole county. The neighbourhood had a week of preparation, and the entries for the Coningsby steeplechase were numerous. Lord Monmouth, after a reserve for his own account, placed his stable at the service of his guests. For himself he offered to back his horse, Sir Robert, which was to be ridden by his grandson. Now nothing was spoken of or thought of at Coningsby Castle except the coming sport. The ladies shared the general excitement. They embroidered handkerchiefs and scarfs and gloves with the respective colours of the rivals, and tried to make jockey caps. Lady St. Julians postponed her intended departure in consequence. Madame Colonna wished that some means could be contrived by which they might all win. Sidonia, with the other competitors, had ridden over the ground and glanced at the brook with the eye of a workman. On his return to the castle he sent a dispatch for some of his stud. Coningsby was all anxiety to win. He was proud of the confidence of his grandfather in backing him. He had a powerful horse and a first-rate fencer, and he was resolved himself not to flinch. On the night before the race, retiring somewhat earlier than usual to his chamber, he observed on his dressing-table a small packet addressed to his name and in an unknown handwriting. Opening it, he found a pretty racing jacket embroidered with his colours of pink and white. This was a perplexing circumstance, but he fancied it on the whole a happy omen. And who was the donor? Certainly not the Princess Lucretia, for he had observed her fashioning some maroon ribbons which were the colours of Sidonia. It could scarcely be from Mrs. Guy Flouncey. Perhaps Madame Colonna, to please the Marquis? Thinking over this incident, he fell asleep. The morning before the race Sidonia's horses arrived. All went to examine them at the stables. Among them was an Arab mare. Coningsby recognised the daughter of the Star. She was greatly admired for her points, but Guy Flouncey whispered to Mr. Melton that she could never do the work. "But Lord Beaumanoir says he is all for speed and against strength in these affairs," said Mr. Melton. Guy Flouncey smiled incredulously. The night before the race it rained rather heavily. "I take it the country will not be very like the deserts of Arabia," said Mr. Guy Flouncey with a knowing look to Mr. Melton, who was noting a bet in his memorandum book. The morning was fine, clear, and sunny, with a soft western breeze. The starting post was about 3 miles from the castle, but long before the hour the surrounding hills were covered with people, squire and farmer, with no lack of their wives and daughters, many a hind in his smock frock, and many an operative from the neighbouring factories. The gentlemen riders gradually arrived. The entries were very numerous, though it was understood that not more than a dozen would come to the post, and half of these were the guests of Lord Monmouth. At 1:30 the cortège from the castle arrived, and took up the post which had been prepared for them on the summit of the hill. Lord Monmouth was much cheered on his arrival. In the carriage with him were Madame Colonna and Lady St. Julians. The Princess Lucretia, Lady Gaythorpe, Mrs. Guy Flouncey, accompanied by Lord Eskdale and other cavaliers, formed a brilliant company. There was scarcely a domestic in the castle who was not there. The comedians, indeed, did not care to come, but Villebecque prevailed upon Flora to drive with him to the race in a buggy he borrowed of the steward. The start was to be at 2:00. The gentlemen jockeys are mustered. Never were riders mounted and appointed in better style. The stewards and the clerk of the course attend them at the starting post. There they are, now assembled. Guy Flouncey takes up his stirrup leathers a hole. Mr. Melton looks at his girths. In a few moments the irrevocable monosyllable will be uttered. The bugle sounds for them to face about. The clerk of the course sings out, "Gentlemen, are you all ready?" No objection made. The word given to go, and 15 riders start in excellent style. Prince Colonna, who rode like Prince Rupert, took the lead, followed closely by a stout yeoman on an old white horse of great provincial celebrity, who made steady running, and from his appearance and action an awkward customer. The rest, with 2 exceptions, followed in a cluster at no great distance, and in this order they continued, with very slight variation, for the first 2 miles, though there were several ox fences, and 1 or 2 of them remarkably stiff. Indeed, they appeared more like horses running over a course than over a country. The 2 exceptions were Lord Beaumanoir on his horse Sunbeam, and Sidonia on the Arab. These kept somewhat slightly in the rear. Almost in this wise they approached the dreaded brook. Indeed, with the exception of the last 2 riders, who were about 30 yards behind, it seemed that you might have covered the rest of the field with a sheet. They arrived at the brook at the same moment. 17 feet of water between strong, sound banks is no holiday work, but they charged with unfaltering intrepidity. But what a revolution in their spirited order did that instant produce! A masked battery of canister and grape could not have achieved more terrible execution. Coningsby alone clearly lighted on the opposing bank, but for the rest of them it seemed for a moment that they were all in the middle of the brook, one over another, splashing, kicking, swearing, every one trying to get out and keep others in. Mr. Melton and the stout yeoman regained their saddles, and were soon again in the chase. The Prince lost his horse, and was not alone in his misfortune. Mr. Guy Flouncey lay on his back, with a horse across his diaphragm, only his head above water, and his mouth full of chickweed and dock leaves. And if help had not been at hand, he and several others might have remained struggling in their watery bed for a considerable period. In the midst of this turmoil, the Marquess and Sidonia at the same moment cleared the brook. Affairs now became interesting. Here Coningsby took up the running, Sidonia and the Marquess lying close at his quarters. Mr. Melton had gone the wrong side of a flag, and the stout yeoman, though close at hand, was already trusting much to his spurs. In the extreme discomfort might be detected 3 or 4 stragglers. Thus they continued until within 3 fields of home. A ploughed field finished the old white horse. The yeoman struck his spurs to the rowels, but the only effect of the experiment was that the horse stood stock still. Coningsby, Sidonia, and the Marquess were now all together. The winning post is in sight, and a high and strong gate leads to the last field. Coningsby, looking like a winner, gallantly dashed forward and sent Sir Robert at the gate, but he had overestimated his horse's powers at this point of the game, and a rattling fall was the consequence. However, horse and rider were both on the right side, and Coningsby was in his saddle and at work again in a moment. It seemed that the Marquess was winning. There was only one more fence, and that the foot people had made a breach in by the side of a gate post, and wide enough, as was said, for a broad-wheeled waggon to travel by. Instead of passing straight over this gap, Sunbeam swerved suddenly against the gate and threw his rider. This was decisive. The daughter of the Star, who was still going beautifully, pulling double, and her jockey sitting still, sprang over the gap and went in first, Coningsby on Sir Robert being placed second. The distance measured was about 4 miles. There were 39 leaps, and it was done under 15 minutes. Lord Monmouth was well content with the prowess of his grandson, and his extreme cordiality consoled Coningsby under a defeat which was very vexatious. It was some alleviation that he was beaten by Sidonia. Madame Colonna even shed tears at her young friend's disappointment, and mourned it especially for Lucretia, who had said nothing, though a flush might be observed on her usually pale countenance. Villebecque, who had betted, was so extremely excited by the whole affair, especially during the last 3 minutes, that he quite forgot his quiet companion, and when he looked round he found Flora fainting. "You rode well," said Sidonia to Coningsby, "but your horse was more strong than swift. After all, this thing is a race, and, notwithstanding Solomon, in a race speed must win." End of chapter 14. Book 4, Chapter 15. Notwithstanding the fatigues of the morning, the evening was passed with great gaiety at the castle. The gentlemen all vowed that, far from being inconvenienced by their mishaps, they felt on the whole rather better for them. Mr. Guy Flouncey, indeed, did not seem quite so limber and flexible as usual, and the young guardsman, who had previously discoursed in an almost alarming style of the perils and feats of the Kildare country, had subsided into a remarkable reserve. The provincials were delighted with Sidonia's riding, and even the Leicestershire gentleman admitted that he was a customer. Lord Monmouth beckoned to Coningsby to sit by him on the sofa, and spoke of his approaching university life. He gave his grandson a great deal of good advice, told him to avoid drinking, especially if he ever chanced to play cards, which he hoped he never would, urged the expediency of never borrowing money, and of confining his loans to small sums, and then only to friends of whom he wished to get rid of, most particularly impressed on him never to permit his feelings to be engaged by any woman. Nobody, he assured Coningsby, despised that weakness more than women themselves. Indeed, feeling of any kind did not suit the present age. It was not bon ton, and in some degree always made a man ridiculous. Coningsby was always to have before him the possible catastrophe of becoming ridiculous. It was the test of conduct, Lord Monmouth said. A fear of becoming ridiculous is the best guide in life, and will save a man from all sorts of scrapes. For the rest, Coningsby was to appear at Cambridge as became Lord Monmouth's favourite grandson. His grandfather had opened an account for him with Drummond's, on whom he was to draw for his considerable allowance, and if by any chance he found himself in a scrape, no matter of what kind, he was to be sure to write to his grandfather, who would certainly get him out of it. "Your departure is sudden," said the Princess Lucretia, in a low, deep tone to Sidonia, who was sitting by her side and screened from general observation by the waltzers who whirled by. "Departures should be sudden." "I do not like departures," said the Princess. "Nor did the Queen of Sheba when she quitted Solomon. You know what she did?" "Tell me." "She wept very much, and let one of the king's birds fly into the garden. 'You are freed from your cage,' she said, 'but I am going back to mine.'" "But you never weep?" said the Princess. "Never." "And are always free?" "So are men in the desert." "But your life is not a desert." "It at least resembles the desert in one respect. It is useless." "The only useless life is woman's." "Yet there have been heroines," said Sidonia. "The Queen of Sheba," said the Princess, smiling. "A favourite of mine," said Sidonia. "And why was she a favourite of yours?" rather eagerly inquired Lucretia. "Because she thought deeply, talked finely, and moved gracefully." "And yet might be a very unfeeling dame at the same time," said the Princess. "I never thought of that," said Sidonia. "The heart, apparently, does not reckon in your philosophy." "What we call the heart," said Sidonia, "is a nervous sensation, like shyness, which gradually disappears in society. It is fervent in the nursery, strong in the domestic circle, tumultuous at school. The affections are the children of ignorance. When the horizon of our experience expands, and models multiply, love and admiration imperceptibly vanish." "I fear the horizon of your experience has very greatly expanded. With your opinions, what charm can there be in life?" "The sense of existence." "So Sidonia is off to morrow, Monmouth?" said Lord Eskdale. "Ha!" said the Marquess. "I must get him to breakfast with me before he goes." The party broke up. Coningsby, who had heard Lord Eskdale announce Sidonia's departure, lingered to express his regret and say farewell. "I cannot sleep," said Sidonia, "and I never smoke in Europe. If you are not stiff with your wounds, come to my rooms." This invitation was willingly accepted. "I am going to Cambridge in a week," said Coningsby. "I was almost in hopes you might have remained as long." "I also, but my letters of this morning demand me. If it had not been for our chase, I should have quitted immediately. The Minister cannot pay the interest on the national debt, not an unprecedented circumstance, and has applied to us. I never permit any business of state to be transacted without my personal interposition, and so I must go up to town immediately." "Suppose you don't pay it?" said Coningsby, smiling. "If I followed my own impulse, I would remain here," said Sidonia. "Can anything be more absurd than that a nation should apply to an individual to maintain its credit, and, with its credit, its existence as an empire, and its comfort as a people; and that individual one to whom its laws deny the proudest rights of citizenship, the privilege of sitting in its senate and of holding land? For though I have been rash enough to buy several estates, my own opinion is that by the existing law of England an Englishman of Hebrew faith cannot possess the soil." "But surely it would be easy to repeal a law so illiberal." "Oh, as for illiberality, I have no objection to it if it be an element of power. Eschew political sentimentalism. What I contend is that if you permit men to accumulate property, and they use that permission to a great extent, power is inseparable from that property, and it is in the last degree impolitic to make it the interest of any powerful class to oppose the institutions under which they live. The Jews, for example, independently of the capital qualities for citizenship which they possess in their industry, temperance, and energy and vivacity of mind, are a race essentially monarchical, deeply religious, and shrinking themselves from converts as from a calamity, are ever anxious to see the religious systems of the countries in which they live flourish. Yet, since your society has become agitated in England, and powerful combinations menace your institutions, you find the once loyal Hebrew invariably arrayed in the same ranks as the leveller and the latitudinarian, and prepared to support the policy which may even endanger his life and property, rather than tamely continue under a system which seeks to degrade him. The Tories lose an important election at a critical moment. 'Tis the Jews come forward to vote against them. The Church is alarmed at the scheme of a latitudinarian university, and learns with relief that funds are not forthcoming for its establishment. A Jew immediately advances and endows it. Yet the Jews, Coningsby, are essentially Tories. Toryism, indeed, is but copied from the mighty prototype which has fashioned Europe, and every generation they must become more powerful and more dangerous to the society which is hostile to them. Do you think that the quiet, humdrum persecution of a decorous representative of an English university can crush those who have successively baffled the Pharaohs, Nebuchadnezzar, Rome, and the feudal ages? The fact is, you cannot destroy a pure race of the Caucasian organization. It is a physiological fact, a simple law of nature, which has baffled Egyptian and Assyrian kings, Roman emperors, and Christian inquisitors. No penal laws, no physical tortures can effect that a superior race should be absorbed in an inferior, or be destroyed by it. The mixed persecuting races disappear, the pure persecuted race remains. And at this moment, in spite of centuries, of tens of centuries of degradation, the Jewish mind exercises a vast influence on the affairs of Europe. I speak not of their laws, which you still obey, of their literature, with which your minds are saturated, but of the living Hebrew intellect. You never observe a great intellectual movement in Europe in which the Jews do not greatly participate. The first Jesuits were Jews. That mysterious Russian diplomacy which so alarms Western Europe is organized and principally carried on by Jews. That mighty revolution which is at this moment preparing in Germany, and which will be in fact the second and greater Reformation, and of which so little is as yet known in England, is entirely developing under the auspices of Jews who almost monopolize the professorial chairs of Germany. Neander, the founder of spiritual Christianity, and who is Regius Professor of Divinity in the University of Berlin, is a Jew. Benari, equally famous, and in the same university, is a Jew. Weil, the Arabic professor of Heidelberg, is a Jew. Years ago, when I was in Palestine, I met a German student who was accumulating materials for the history of Christianity and studying the genius of the place, a modest and learned man. It was Weil, then unknown, since become the first Arabic scholar of the day and the author of the Life of Mahomet. But for the German professors of this race, their name is legion. I think there are more than 10 at Berlin alone. I told you just now that I was going up to town tomorrow, because I always made it a rule to interpose when affairs of state were on the carpet. Otherwise I never interfere. I hear of peace and war in newspapers, but I am never alarmed, except when I am informed that the sovereigns want treasure. Then I know that monarchs are serious. A few years back we were applied to by Russia. Now there has been no friendship between the court of St. Petersburg and my family. It has Dutch connections, which have generally supplied it, and our representations in favour of the Polish Hebrews a numerous race, but the most suffering and degraded of all the tribes, have not been very agreeable to the Tsar. However, circumstances drew to an approximation between the Romanovs and the Sidonias. I resolved to go myself to St. Petersburg. I had, on my arrival, an interview with the Russian Minister of Finance, Count Cankrin. I beheld the son of a Lithuanian Jew. The loan was connected with the affairs of Spain. I resolved on repairing to Spain from Russia. I travelled without intermission. I had an audience immediately on my arrival with the Spanish minister, Señor Mendizabel. I beheld one like myself, the son of a Nuevo Cristiano, a Jew of Aragon. In consequence of what transpired at Madrid, I went straight to Paris to consult the President of the French Council. I beheld the son of a French Jew, a hero, an imperial marshal, and very properly, for who should be military heroes if not those who worship the Lord of Hosts? And is Soult a Hebrew? Yes, and others of the French marshals, and the most famous, Massena, for example. His real name was Manasseh. But to my anecdote. The consequence of our consultations was that some northern power should be applied to in a friendly and mediative capacity. We fixed on Prussia, and the President of the Council made an application to the Prussian minister, who attended a few days after our conference. Count Arnim entered the cabinet, and I beheld a Prussian Jew. So you see, my dear Coningsby, that the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. You startle and deeply interest me. You must study physiology, my dear child. Pure races of Caucasus may be persecuted, but they cannot be despised, except by the brutal ignorance of some mongrel breed that brandishes faggots and howls extermination, but is itself exterminated without persecution by that irresistible law of nature which is fatal to curs. But I come also from Caucasus, said Coningsby. Verily, and thank your Creator for such a destiny, and your race is sufficiently pure. You come from the shores of the northern sea, land of the blue eye and the golden hair and the frank brow. 'Tis a famous breed, with whom we Arabs have contended long, from whom we have suffered much. But these Goths and Saxons and Normans were doubtless great men. But so favoured by nature, why has not your race produced great poets, great orators, great writers? Favoured by nature and by nature's God, we produced the lyre of David. We gave you Isaiah and Ezekiel. They are our Elinthians, our Philippics. Favoured by nature we still remain, but in exact proportion as we have been favoured by nature, we have been persecuted by man. After 1,000 struggles, after acts of heroic courage that Rome has never equalled, deeds of divine patriotism that Athens and Sparta and Carthage have never excelled, we have endured 1,500 years of supernatural slavery, during which every device that can degrade or destroy man has been the destiny that we have sustained and baffled. The Hebrew child has entered adolescence only to learn that he was the pariah of that ungrateful Europe that owes to him the best part of its laws, a fine portion of its literature, all its religion. Great poets require a public. We have been content with the immortal melodies that we sung more than 2,000 years ago by the waters of Babylon, and wept. They record our triumphs, they solace our affliction. Great orators are the creatures of popular assemblies. We were permitted only by stealth to meet even in our temples. As for great writers, the catalogue is not blank. Where are all the schoolmen, Aquinas himself to Maimonides? And as for modern philosophy, all springs from Spinoza. But the passionate and creative genius that is the nearest link to divinity, and which no human tyranny can destroy, though it can divert it, that should have stirred the hearts of nations by its inspired sympathy, or governed senates by its burning eloquence, has found a medium for its expression to which, in spite of your prejudices and your evil passions, you have been obliged to bow. The ear, the voice, the fancy teeming with combinations, the imagination fervent with picture and emotion that came from Caucasus and which we have preserved unpolluted, have endowed us with almost the exclusive privilege of music, that science of harmonious sounds which the ancients recognized as most divine and deified in the person of their most beautiful creation. I speak not of the past, though were I to enter into the history of the lords of melody, you would find it the annals of Hebrew genius. But at this moment even, musical Europe is ours. There is not a company of singers, not an orchestra in a single capital, that is not crowded with our children under the feigned names which they adopt to conciliate the dark aversion which your posterity will some day disclaim with shame and disgust. Almost every great composer, skilled musician, almost every voice that ravishes you with its transporting strains, springs from our tribes. The catalogue is too vast to enumerate, too illustrious to dwell for a moment on secondary names, however eminent. Enough for us that the three great creative minds to whose exquisite inventions all nations at this moment yield, Rossini, Meyerbeer, Mendelssohn, are of Hebrew race, and little do your men of fashion, your muscadins of Paris, and your dandies of London, as they thrill into raptions at the notes of a Pasta or a Grisi, little do they suspect that they are offering their homage to the sweet singers of Israel. End of chapter 15.